Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a slow, wandering walk through your own body. Not the shiny health app version, but the scraped up, leaky, improvisational machine that got you here. Picture yourself lying there in a dim room. The ceiling fan hums in lazy circles. You take a breath, and somewhere in that breath is a story that runs back millions of years, tangled in choices you never made. You probably won't survive this. At least, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments so we can see who else is sleepless with us tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Together, you step into a kind of twilight corridor, not made of bricks or steel, but of countless echoes. With every footfall, you're walking backward in time, passing doors labeled with faint little evolutionary experiments. One door shows something like you, but squatter, covered in fur. Another, farther down, reveals a creature paddling in shallow water, its limbs growing strong enough to push against mud and current. You realize that from the skin on your knuckles to the way your spine curves when you slouch at your desk, all these quirks are signed by the same author, trial and error. Scrawled over eons, you think of design, the clean sweep of a perfectly drawn blueprint, every line deliberate. That's not what lives under your skin. What lives there is more like a stage prop repaired with duct tape backstage minutes before curtain. Your knees complain because they're doing double duty as shock absorbers and balance keepers for an upright frame never meant to run marathons. Your jaw sometimes aches because our ancestors squeezed more teeth into smaller, reshaped skulls once brains started hogging the space. You move deeper into the hush dark, stepping over a loose cord. The cord being, in this imagined corridor, your own spinal column. Evolution didn't scrap it and start fresh. It just bent a quadruped spine into an S shape to keep your head above your feet. Great for surveying the savannah. Not so great after 8 hours hunched over a laptop. You feel that familiar ache rise just thinking about it. Somewhere behind you, you hear the whisper of a tale you no longer have. Not gone entirely, just reduced to a stub of bone at the base of your spine. A souvenir from a time you swung between branches or balanced on a narrow limb. We carry so many of these little fossils inside ourselves, and most of the time you ignore them until something twinges, and you're reminded that you're built more from memory than from modern needs. One mainstream fact to listen. Imagine stepping into East Africa about 3.2 million years ago, where Lucy, the famous Australopithecus afarensis skeleton, walked upright with a pelvis shaped awkwardly between ape and human. That pelvis is your inheritance, part of the reason childbirth in humans is far riskier than in most mammals. You smile faintly. Not that it's comforting to know childbirth's danger is ancient, but because there's an odd intimacy in realizing your body is a palimpsest, written and rewritten by millions of hands you'll never meet. One quirky or fringe fact to listen, and somewhere, in a pile of old herbal scrolls, you find mention of crocodile dung once being used by some ancient Egyptians as a form of birth control. Is an improvement. Historians still argue whether upright walking emerged more for scavenging long distances or for keeping cool under a blazing sun. Either way, your knees got stuck with the bill. You pause, hand on your ribs. They're curved like a cage, but a fragile cage, breakable, because the priority was always flexible breathing, not armor. In the quiet, you notice how that breath comes in waves. You think of the diaphragm below, a muscle we share with other mammals, the kind of perfect old part that's been kept intact while so much else was jerry-rigged. You let that breath go and feel the tiny clicks in your shoulders. Ball and socket joints, versatile enough to loft a spear or swing a tennis racket, but far less stable than the weight-bearing hips of your lower body. Those clicks are the sound of compromise, mobility traded for vulnerability. Corridor, your walking narrows, and on either side are murals of your species' past. You run your fingers over one, a painted figure squatting by a fire, the orange glow flickering against a face just enough like yours to make you uneasy. Hunger was the sculptor's chisel here. Cooking softened food, shortened our intestinal tracts, and freed energy for bigger brains. That meant smaller jaws and, over time, a crowded dental arcade. Wisdom teeth became squatters with no place to live. Yours might have been pulled, or maybe they're still buried in bones, plotting their eventual rebellion. Your steps are slow now, almost hesitant, because the next mural is Roar, a mother carrying a child, her spine angled forward under the weight. 2 million years ago, there was no ergonomic baby carrier. The human frame adapted in small ways, shifting pelvis and muscle balance. Pregnancies ran the gauntlet between 2 large infant heads and 2 narrow birth canals, and that tension has never fully eased. Every upright stride you take today leans on those ancient bets, placed before anyone knew how crowded cities or ergonomic office chairs would change the game. You reach a bend in the corridor. The floor dips slightly, and you're aware of your arches, less graceful architecture, more dictated by a need for energy-efficient walking. Each step rolls from heel to toe, a marvel of balance that's equally prone to flat-foot aches, or plantar fasciitis, the moment the parts get worn. In your mind, you see a flash of early human footprints pressed into volcanic ash, the Laetoli tracks. Still there, after 3.6 million years, generations walked past that moment, unaware their own feet would someday be scanned, measured, shoe-fitted, and sometimes surgically altered. The smell of dust grows stronger. You picture lungs delicate as silk, but with alveoli spread like fields, trading gases in a process so fine-tuned it's almost invisible. Yet those same lungs can be undone by a few inhaled fibers or a stray spore. We carry forward this fragility, along with endurance, able to run long distances in midday heat, to outlast faster animals simply by keeping cool and breathing steadily. And here's another quiet reminder. Your skin prickles. It's dripping with sweat glands, more than almost any other mammal. In evolutionary terms, that's your supercooling system. Shade and breezes carry off heat, letting you keep hunting or wandering when predators slump in exhaustion. It's clever and messy. Sweat drains salt from you, invites bacteria to set up shop, and guarantees you'll never be far from laundry. You glance back only once, catching the faint shimmer of that tailbone memory again, and keep walking deeper into your own design's blind alleys, wondering which part will murmur its complaint next. You brush your palm across the faint etchings on the corridor wall and feel bone beneath stone. not actual bone, but the idea of it, the engineering. Compromise, that is your skeleton. It's light enough to let you walk upright for hours, yet brittle enough that a poorly angled fall can cost you weeks in a cast. The ribs guarding your heart and lungs are thin as cage bars. The bones in your hand, so nimble for holding brushes or threading needles, are also so small that one wrong twist can snap them. The corridor bends again, and in the hush you hear a faint creak. It's the sound your knees make in the morning, magnified so the whole passage resonates with it. You remember that your knees are retooled hinge joints, optimized for a quadruped that never needed to vault up subway stairs or squat for hours. Mapped in old sepia drawings, the stomach, looping and muscular, once handled. Raw roots, meat flecked with grit, and unwashed leaves. Now it churns over spiced instant noodles and coffee, still using the same acid strength strong enough to pit metal. The intestines coil behind it, absorbing what they can, but also serving as a reminder. The appendix is still there, a quiet, blind pouch along that route. It may help with immune function now, but it's mostly an echo from when plant cellulose ruled the menu. You step closer and feel warmth, not from the display, but from the thought of heat itself. Your body is a furnace, burning glucose and fat around the clock. You carry a layer of insulation, sometimes more than you'd like. But that fat was once survival currency, keeping famine from killing you in lean winters. The balance is delicate. The same storage that saves you can, in a world of excess food, work against you. The scene shifts, and you're suddenly standing beside a shadow of an Ice Age ancestor wrapped in animal hide. His fingers are red from the cold, and you notice how short they are compared to yours, an adaptation for heat conservation. Yours can type, play an instrument, or swipe a touchscreen, but in numb cold they betray you, stiffening fast. Evolution didn't optimize for every climate, just for the ones that sustained survival long enough to pass along your code. One mainstream fact to listen. You pause here to remember that Homo sapiens as a species has only been around for about 300,000 years, a blink in geological time. Yet in that blink, our bodies have carried forward tool wielders' hands, runners' legs, and an omnivore's teeth, all repurposed dozens of times in the march from savannas to skyscrapers. One quirky or fringe fact to listen. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you hear a curious note, whispers of early Europeans, supposedly using powdered mummies bought from looters in Egypt as a kind of medicine. It's a bizarre human loop, salvaging one body to fix another, a tradition as questionable as the crocodile dung trick. Historians still argue whether the earliest members of our genus survived harsher ice age, cold primarily by adjusting their diet or their clothing. Bone tools and dietary remains offer hints, but the answer's still hazy. You keep moving, and the corridor opens into a vast space shaped like a ribcage. Light trickles in from high slits, falling on the curves of bone above. It is both beautiful and flawed. This design you live in, just good enough to keep you going. Never quite as perfect as you imagine when looking in a mirror. You step under those high, bone-like arches and hear your own heartbeat growing louder. It's not the thud of panic, but the persistent, steady drum that's been with you since before you were born. Your heart is an old pump, stitched together from the same muscular blueprint, shared by fish, reptiles, and mammals, for chambers. Now, pushing blood two ways at once to your lungs for oxygen, and out to every other cell, begging for sustenance. But even this pump is a compromise. It can last decades, sometimes more than a century, yet its parts wear. Valves can stiffen, vessels can clog, and the rhythm sometimes falters. You trail your fingertips along the wall, tracing faint branching lines. They mirror the arteries and veins inside you. The largest, like tree trunks, pulse quietly but powerfully. The smallest capillaries, finer than hair, spread like hidden forests beneath your skin. You think of how easily they bruise, smudging purple with a careless bump. This network is both masterfully efficient and frustratingly fragile, still stitched together from patterns first perfected in creatures far unlike you. The corridor floor shifts underfoot, and suddenly you're walking a surface that rises and falls, almost like a diaphragm breathing. It makes you think of the rhythmic lift and drop beneath your own ribs. That thin dome of muscle never really rests. Even as you sleep, it shuttles air in and out with quiet insistence. Without it, there is no wandering through nighttime corridors, contemplating ancient bone. And yet, it too can be undone by injury or disease in a blink. Somewhere far ahead, you pick up a smell, faint, almost sweet. It reminds you of ripened fruit, and before you realize it, you're thinking about senses. Your nose, for instance, is a hurried remodel. It can detect thousands of scents, but compared to many mammals, it's a dull sensor. Our ancestors, perhaps, traded some olfactory sharpness for enhanced vision and complex color perception. You run a hand over the bony ridge beneath your eyes, noting how open they face forward. That's predator vision, binocular and precise, ideal for tracking movement, but also prone to strain and myopia in a world where you now focus on glowing rectangles inches from your face. You tilt your head up, taking in the slits of light far above, and realize they remind you of the way your pupils narrow. Those black wells are just holes in muscle-controlled tissue, letting in more or less light, adjusting constantly, almost without thought. Yet your eyes are riddled with design quirks, a blind spot where the optic nerve exits, blood vessels, draped inelegantly across the retina, delicate jelly that can detach after too many decades. Your footsteps echo as you walk on, and the sound drifts strangely, as though bounced around by invisible architecture. That's when you think about ears, not just the outer curves you see in a mirror, but the hidden, coiled seashells of the inner ear. They balance you as much as they let you hear. Little fluid-filled chambers, originally adapted from the lateral line system of fish, perfect for a watery life, oddly prone to infection or motion sickness on land. One mainstream fact to listen. You picture the fossil of Tiktaalik, discovered in Arctic Canada, a creature from about 375 million years ago that was neither fully fish nor fully with jointed fins and rudimentary wrists. A hint that the limbs bearing you now once paddled in shallow water. One quirky or fringe fact to listen. A whisper from history notes that in the Victorian era, some believed blowing tobacco smoke into the ear could treat certain ailments, an image that is equal parts absurd and oddly fitting in humanity's long trial and error history of fixing itself. Historians still argue whether reduced Smell in humans was an unavoidable trade for brain expansion, or whether it was a side effect of shifting ecological niches. The evidence sits somewhere between bones and brain scans, without a decisive verdict. Ahead, the corridor narrows again, drawing you into shadow, as though your body's blueprints are ushering you toward the older rooms, where stranger compromises lie waiting. You edge into that narrowing stretch of corridor, the light slipping away until you're moving mostly by feel. The walls here feel older, rougher, like the blueprint drafts that never made it to the showroom. Your fingertips find grooves in the stone, uneven and erratic, much like the way your own nerves run through your body. They're not laid out like neat circuit boards. They meander. Some double back. Some take absurd detours, like the laryngeal nerve in your throat that loops all the way down near your heart before coming back up to serve your voice. Box, a root inherited from fish anatomy that made far more sense when necks weren't yet a thing. You pause at that thought, holding your own throat lightly, feeling the soft flutter beneath the vibration of vocal cords, adapted first for breathing, then for crude sound, and finally, much later, refined into singing, storytelling, and whispering in the dark to someone who's just fallen half asleep. Speech is an elegant improvisation. The plumbing underneath is an evolutionary afterthought. That's why food can go down the wrong way. The airway and food pipe still share a front hallway that was never gracefully partitioned. Your bare feet register a change. The floor here is uneven, patterned with low mounds, small humps that remind you of the vertebrae stacked inside your back, each one a ring supporting the vertical tower of your life. They carry you, pivot you, bend you forward when you pick up something dropped, and sometimes they pinch the nerves threaded between them, sending hot, electric reminders that upright life came with a cost. The S-shaped spine is a balance master, but also a pain magnet. Too curved, and you hunch. Too straight, and you sway. Somewhere in the darkness, there's a sound like a slow drip. It makes you think of the fluids coursing through you at this second blood. Yes, but also lymph, cerebrospinal fluid, digestive juices, synovial lubrication for your joints. You are, for the most part, a walking water balloon wrapped in proteins. And skin and gravity never lets you forget it. You stop before a rusted doorframe in the corridor wall. Hanging there like faded laundry are tendons, or rather, they're ghostly analogs stretched taut between invisible bones. You think about how tendons and ligaments give structure, transmit force, and yet, once torn, rarely heal with the same perfection. They weren't built for centuries of strain. They were built to get an adult through reproductive years with minimal catastrophic failure. Beyond that age, biology drops most warranties. One mainstream fact to listen. You remember that the human Achilles tendon is one of the strongest in the body and a key reason we can run long distances. Yet it's also one of the most frequently injured. A prime example of strength and vulnerability, sharing the same dress. One quirky or fringe fact to listen. A murmur of old maritime lore reaches you. That sailors once believed rubbing raw onions on sore joints could draw out the sea cold. Science, no, but charm, absolutely. Historians still argue whether the refinement of endurance running in humans evolved for persistence hunting or simply as a byproduct of other walking adaptations, and there's still no neat consensus. You Move onward, and now the corridor ceiling dips until you have to stoop. Spine curling, just like it did in the dim canopy tunnels of your ancestors' forests. You realize in that bent moment that you're carrying every compromise ever made, a million small trade-offs, none perfect, all functional enough to get you here. Breathing in the hush dark of your own body's strange architectural tours, you shuffle forward through that low-ceilinged stretch, each step making your back ache just a little from the stoop. It's not unlike the ache your ancestors might have felt after hours foraging in undergrowth or crouching by a fire. As you straighten again, the space widens unexpectedly, opening into a round chamber whose walls ripple like muscle fibers under strain. The floor here feels springy, almost alive, and you realize it mirrors the texture of your own muscles, bundles of fibers, each made from tiny cells that contract in perfect unison, pulling on tendons to move bones, strong enough to heft a heavy box, delicate enough to pick up a pin. But muscle is an expensive luxury. It demands constant feedings of oxygen and nutrients, and it wastes away when idle, as though evolution refuses to let you keep strength you don't actively use. The faint hum of the place changes pitch, like a whispered note shifting key. It makes you think about the electrical signals that tick through your body at every moment, leaping between nerve endings and triggering each heartbeat, breath, and blink without you telling them to. Those impulses are lightning fast and yet rooted through an organic tangle that can misfire. A pinch in the neck sending tingling down your arm. A fall stopping signals entirely. You run a hand along one wall and feel it twitch under your fingers, the closest your mind can get to imagining the involuntary reactions of your own body. Reflex arcs, born of survival, cutting out the brain entirely, so your hand yanks from a flame before you consciously tell it to. Helpful, yes, but sometimes oddly misplaced. The same recoil that saves you from fire can make you drop something harmless, just because it startled your palm. A pool of dim light gathers at the room's center, and under it stands a curious structure, like a tree made of pale cords. At its base, thick roots twist together, your spinal cord. From there, smaller cables branch and thin, sending messages down arms, into legs, across the fine planes of your face, so you can smile, frown, or raise a skeptical brow mid-conversation. But even this central trunk is vulnerable. One hard break, and the whole landscape beyond it goes silent. One mainstream fact to listen. You recall that in early medical history, the ancient Greek physician Herophilos was among the first to describe the nervous system, carefully examining the brain and nerves over 2 millennia ago in Alexandria, and even then, its complexity baffled him. One quirky or fringe fact to listen. Somewhere in dusty archives hides the note of a medieval belief that touching the severed hand of a hanged man could cure various ailments. A macabre reminder that humans have always sought power in unlikely places. Historians still argue whether increased brain complexity drove the expansion of fine motor control in our hands, or whether tool use itself pushed brains to grow and specialize. The answer is tangled, like roots and branches feeding each other in the same tree. You step back from the glowing cord tree, feeling the thrum of your own nerves in your fingertips. This whole place, every hall, every echo, is an imperfect masterpiece, a patchwork of brilliance and blunder. And yet here you are, moving through it, guided by systems older and stranger than you can quite imagine, all just functional enough to carry you one step further into the story. You leave that pale cord tree behind, and the corridor seems to slope gently downward, like a stream carved over ages. The walls change again. Their texture now feels layered, like sediment, each layer a faint memory your body carries. One band feels dense and chalky, the mineral core of your bones, where calcium and collagen braid together into a tough composite. Strong, yes, but also porous if neglected, slowly losing density as the decades pass. Your skeleton isn't a fixed statue. It's a living scaffold, constantly being broken down and rebuilt, a quiet renovation crew at work, whether you notice or not. Your foot slips slightly on the smooth floor, and you catch yourself, realizing how an intricate balance system saved you from a fall. Tiny hairs in your inner ear, small pressure shifts under your skin, micro adjustments in your leg muscles, all of them firing in fractions of a second to keep you upright. It works so well most of the time that you forget it exists, until a moment of dizziness reminds you that this harmony can be thrown off by illness, fatigue, even just standing too fast at the far end of the slope. You find an open archway leading into a softly lit hall. It hums with a different energy, slower, steadier. Here, the walls are marked with looping patterns that mimic your circulatory loops, arteries branching to reach remote corners of yourself, veins guiding blood back toward the lung pump heart cycle. It's in this quiet that you remember every cell is nourished and cleansed by this endless tide, and yet the rivers can be choked by clots, by plaques, by pressures building unseen. You wander to the center of the hall and look up. Above you, a faint dome glows with flickers, like stars, but they're not stars. They are signals firing a reminder that your brain, a wrinkled lump of fat and water, is the conductor of this entire imperfect orchestra. Billions of neurons spark and whisper to each other, creating the illusion that you are singular, cohesive, in control. And yet this same commander misremembers names, forgets why it walked into a room, or one day may fray at the edges with age. You catch sight of a small niche in the hall. Inside, a strange, preserved shape rests, a human larynx. It looks almost alien, cartilage rings, muscles, folds. It's the gatekeeper of your breath and your voice, constantly opening and closing in the background. You think about the songs you've sung, the cries you've made, the soft secrets you've whispered, all carried on folds of tissue thinner than paper, vibrating in moist air. One mainstream fact to listen. You remember that the oldest known musical instrument, a vulture wingbone flute from over 40,000 years ago, wasn't just art. It was anatomy made culture, lungs, breath, and fine motor control, turning air into melody. One quirky or fringe fact to listen. A whisper here reminds you of an old folk belief that drinking from a shrunken skull could gift the drinker with the wisdom of the dead, a chilling testament to the lengths humans will go trying to steal life's imagined advantages. Historians still argue whether language blossomed first as survival coordination, spiritual expression, or simply a side effect of social grooming made more efficient. And, as usual, the truth may be a messy blend that you step out of the room, your senses full of the hum and pulse of the body you inhabit, a machine constantly improvising, carrying the weight of ancient mistakes and accidental miracles. And though you know every part could be better, sleeker, stronger, you feel the subtle marvel in the fact you're still here, moving deeper into this long, flawed hallway of yourself. You keep moving, and the corridor narrows into a space where the air feels warmer, almost humid. Beads of condensation gather on the stone, reminding you instantly of your own skin, that thin, sprawling organ stretched over everything you are. It holds you together, keeps fluids in, keeps most dangers out, but it's also a billboard for your history, holding scars, freckles, lines, and stretch marks, like handwritten notes from the past. In just a few millimeters, it manages to be armor, sensory receiver, and cooling system, all in one, but armor that can blister in the sun, dry in winter air, or slice open with a single, careless slip. The walls here take on a faint, shifting, pattern ridges like fingerprints. You raise your own hand and press it flat against the stone, noticing how your fingerprints are unique to you alone. No one else has the exact same spirals and loops. Once, this individuality might have been meaningless to survival. Now it can decide identity in a courtroom. Evolution doesn't plan these outcomes. It just leaves its little flourishes for later worlds to interpret. A faint patter begins overhead, not rain, but the imagined sound of tiny chemical messengers, hormones, spilling from hidden glands. You think of adrenaline, cortisol, insulin, microscopic instructions that govern moods, energy, and growth. They run invisibly beneath your daily awareness, but tilt them too far, and the whole interconnected system stumbles. Your thyroid, your pancreas, pituitary, each one a quiet operator you forget about until it goes on strike. A bend ahead glows with soft, reddish light. When you step into it, the walls are smooth and curved inward, almost protective, like the inside of a ribcage again. But this time the focus is on what lies within, a gentle, rhythmic whoosh, the sound of blood moving through your brain. This is where the body guards its control room. Floating in fluid, this fragile mass runs on electricity and chemistry, mapping the entirety of you. And yet, remarkably, it is soft enough to be damaged by a single sudden blow. You think briefly of sleep, how your brain needs to retreat into its strange nightly theater to clean itself, filing memories, resetting your moods. Sleep is so essential that depriving you of it long enough can unravel both mind and body. For all its complexity, your brain still depends on the simplest of rhythms: wake, rest, repeat. One mainstream fact to listen. You recall that the human brain, while only about 2% of your body weight, consumes roughly 20% of your resting energy, a staggering demand for such a small organ. One quirky or fringe fact to listen, and then comes an odd whisper of medieval brain tonics made from crushed pearls, believed to sharpen intellect in wealthy courts, a glittering placebo swallowed with hope. Historians still argue whether the evolutionary boost in human brain size was driven more by social complexity or by environmental challenges, or whether those two pressures braided together over millennia. You step back from the softly glowing bend, carrying with you the growing realization that every part of your imperfect design, from the ridges on your skin to the cells firing thoughts in your head, came from a long chain of necessity, accident, and compromise, all converging here in you in this moment. You drift onward, leaving behind the strange, glowing bends of your brain's inner sanctuary, and the corridor reshapes itself wider now, but littered with obstacles like the floor can't decide whether it wants to help you or trip you. It's fitting, you think, because that's exactly how your own design works. A series of blessings wrapped in booby traps. Everywhere you look now, you see bargains made in flesh. Bipedalism, for instance, the big evolutionary headline that let you carry food, wield tools, scan horizons. Yet it shifted your center of gravity so precariously that an icy curb in winter can send you sprawling. The pelvis narrowed to balance walking efficiency with birthing capacity, producing an engineering puzzle nature never really solved, only managed to patch together. And the longer you stay upright in a day, the more your back, hips, and knees send little mutinous reminders about all that weight they're holding. It's a long hallway here, lined with shadow boxes. In one, the curve of a human spine, perfect S from the side, a structural miracle that feels far less miraculous after 8 hours in a chair. In another, a model of the human foot, 26 bones and dozens of ligaments bound into an arch that can carry you across continents. That same arch, though, collapses under strain, giving you the gift no one asked for, plantar fasciitis. Somewhere nearby you can almost hear evolution chuckling. Asterisk, you wanted to run marathons. Sure, but your ankles will wobble like worn door. Hinges by middle-age asterisk. Against one wall stands a strange display. Long runner's legs, poised mid-stride. You walk around them slowly, feeling their power, elongated tendons, storing and releasing energy like springs. Perfect for distance, yes, but vulnerable to tears, sprains, and stress fractures. Every advantage wrapped in a risk. Every step forward shadowed by the possibility of falling hard farther on. The air changes, warm and damp, reminding you of your own skin's role in the grand trade-off game. You sweat more than almost any other mammal, an unparalleled gift for cooling in heat, yet it costs you salt, demands constant hydration, and leaves you at the mercy of microbes claiming spots that no scented soap seems to discourage for long. Your cooling system is also your invitation for inconvenience. You step up to a wide archway, seeing inside a pelvis suspended in mid-air. It rocks gently, like it's waiting for you to notice its story. How evolution wedged childbirth and upright walking into the same frame, forcing a compromise so tight it turned birth into an endurance test, both for the bearer and the new life squeezed through. No other primate has a delivery quite like yours, lengthy, dangerous, occasionally lethal before the age of surgical aid. One mainstream fact to listen. You recall the Laetoli footprints, again, early bipeds, walking side by side more than 3.5 million years ago. That graceful stride was already a compromise between travel efficiency and structural strain. One quirky or fringe fact to listen. Somewhere in the dim, a whisper surfaces of an old belief that eating ground tiger bone could make human joints stronger. Folklore as placebo. An earnest hope layered over biology's sometimes uncaring limits. Historians still argue whether our upright gait evolved primarily to save energy over long distances or to free the hands for carrying the answer. As usual, may be some tangled middle ground you step on deeper into the hall of trade-offs, feeling quietly amazed that a body so riddled with design debt has carried you this far. Ahead, the corridor turns, and with it, the next compromise waits to be revealed. You follow the turn in the hallway, and the air shifts, cooler now, edged with a faint metallic temps. On either side, the walls rise into towering shelves holding tools, not the kind you buy in a hardware store, but biological tools, hands, teeth, lungs, each frozen mid-function, captured at the exact moment they balance brilliance against flaw. You pause beside a set of hands, your hands poised around an invisible task. Their dexterity is almost absurd. Opposable thumbs, fine motor control, the sheer range of motion in those little joints. This is what lets you thread needles, write novels, crack open pistachios without crushing the nut inside. But the price is fragility. Carpals and metacarpals, delicate as they are intricate, can be shattered by one wrong fall. The very sensitivity that lets you feel the grain of paper can also make repetitive strain from typing a daily battle. Next, your eyes catch a glint, teeth lined up in a mocking grin. These elegant little blades and grinders can handle meat, vegetables, seeds, a true omnivore's toolkit. But they come fitted in a jaw too small for them all to sit comfortably. That's how you inherit overcrowding, impaction, and hours. In a dentist's chair, paying for a mismatch carved in bone long before dentistry existed, the corridor floor shifts subtly beneath your feet, tilting you toward a larger alcove. Inside, lungs hang in translucent suspension, inflating and deflating, ever so slightly. You marvel at their efficiency. Millions of alveoli swapping gases so your blood leaves rich in oxygen, ready to fuel every cell. But these sponges are also gateways for wildfire smoke, pathogens, pollutants, and when they're compromised, they carry no backup system. You've only ever had the one set. As you walk onward, another display takes shape, the human eye, magnified until you can see the bundled nerve fibers trailing backward. This jewel of an organ gives you color, detail, depth, yet it's built backwards, with nerves awkwardly crossing in front of the retina. That mistake in layout produces your blind spot. It's a quirk you can learn to ignore. But it's the kind of oversight no engineer would ever plan from scratch. Further down, you pass a set of legs bent into a runner's start. Long tendons, strong quads, shock-absorbing knees. It's a miracle of movement, but one prone to tearing, swelling, and wearing down under too much ambition. Every race, no matter how glorious, risks ending with you limping across the finish line. One mainstream fact to listen. You remember reading that Homo erectus over 1 million years ago likely mastered persistence, hunting, chasing prey for hours under the sun until exhaustion toppled the animal. Our sweat-cooled bodies and long legs made it possible, but not without cost to joints and energy reserves. One quirky or fringe fact to listen. A strange whisper reaches you of ancient attempts at seeing in darkness by swallowing phosphorescent fish, a hope to borrow light from another creature's chemistry. Historians still argue whether our dental issues are a modern problem from softer diets or an ancient flaw amplified by rapid skull reshaping. The evidence points in both directions, because trade-offs rarely have single causes. You step away from the alcove, thinking about how every marvel in you is shadowed by a compromise. sometimes small, sometimes dangerous. In the half-light ahead, you see the next trade-off already waiting. Half-hidden, ready to tell its side of the bargain. You step closer to that half-hidden display, and it slowly brightens to reveal a curved outline your ear. At first, it seems almost inconsequential compared to the lungs or the spine. But then you remember, this is how you navigate sound and balance, a deceptively complex structure. The outer curves funnel vibrations, the tiny ossicles inside amplify them, and the coiled cochlea translates them into signals your brain can read. But the whole setup is fragile. A few loud concerts, an infection in the wrong place, and your hearing may never be the same again. The same canals that steady you on your feet are the ones that can send you reeling with vertigo. When their fluid betrays you, you move on to another corner display that ripples faintly like water, a projection of the human immune system at work. Billions of cells moving, attacking, cleaning, repairing. It's a vigilant militia, ready to defend against invaders. But this fortress sometimes runs rogue, seeing shadows where there are none, mounting attacks against your own tissues. Allergies, autoimmune diseases, these are the friendly fire consequences of a system erring on the side of caution. The next alcove holds something stranger, a cluster of endocrine glands suspended in dim golden light. Here's the thyroid, the adrenal, the pituitary, quiet masterminds, controlling growth, mood, metabolism. You rarely think about them until they tip out of balance, turning energy into exhaustion, calm into jitters, or steady heartbeats into flutters. These glands are your body's silent governors, and yet they, too, carry the warnings of fragility, susceptible to stress, diet, or sheer genetic bad luck. As you walk deeper, you find an unassuming shape in glass, the appendix, a leftover pouch from a bygone dietary era, now a curious backup for immune support. It's small, silent, and you could live without it. But if it bursts at the wrong time, it turns from irrelevant to deadly in the span of hours. That's the gamble. Carrying obsolete hardware that mostly minds its own business until it doesn't. One mainstream fact to listen. You recall that Charles Darwin himself considered the appendix a vestigial organ, a remnant from ancestors who relied on a cellulose-rich diet, its original role eroded by dietary shifts. One quirky or fringe fact to listen. A faint murmur reaches you about medieval cures for ear pain that involved inserting roasted garlic cloves into the ear canal, equal parts kitchen improvisation and questionable therapy. Historians still argue whether the appendix retains significant immune modulating functions or is merely a harmless evolutionary leftover. Studies hint both ways, leaving its true modern role just out of reach. You pause in the hush, struck by how these bargains, organs kept that are no longer essential, systems so vigilant they harm as often as they help, weave your entire existence together. And ahead, half seen in the soft glow, you sense yet more compromises waiting, ready to tell their side of the story. You step away from the glass-cased appendix, and the corridor curves inward again, pulling you toward a low-lit gallery. The air feels thicker here, like you've entered a room heavy with the scent of old paper and preserved specimens. Suspended in the center is a network of blood vessels, dyed deep crimson, fanning out like the branches of a winter tree. You Trace their delicate lines with your eyes, marveling at how they reach into every inch of you. The trade-off is simple but ruthless. This perfect delivery system can also become its own worst enemy, blocking itself with clots, rupturing. In moments of pressure, starving tissues it was meant to feed. Strength and fragility braided into one living map. On the far wall, a slow-turning model of the human knee clicks softly with each rotation. Layer upon layer reveals itself, smooth cartilage, lubricating fluid, precise ligaments. It's a remarkable hinge that learned to bear weight from an angle it was never originally designed for. That adaptation made endurance, walking and running possible, but it also left the joint vulnerable to tears, grinding wear and the creeping stiffness you only truly understand when it settles in permanently. Nearby, a panel slides aside to reveal something unexpectedly small, the sinuses, carved hollows, hidden within your skull. They lighten the head, resonate your voice, and perhaps once served as a pressure buffer. But in modern life, they're also warm, moist havens for bacteria. The reason you know the discomfort of congestion, pressure, and that dull ache above your eyes. A space designed to help becomes a refuge for what hinders. You wander over to another alcove, noticing an unusual display, a pair of human hips rotating slowly as if caught in a slow-motion stride. The ball and socket mechanism gives incredible range for walking, climbing, twisting, yet its shape means that as cartilage thins with age, bone grates into bone, making even short walks a burden. The same structure that carried migrating ancestors across continents can, in later years, turn stairs into mountains. One mainstream fact to listen. You recall that fossil evidence suggests Neanderthals had slightly wider pelvises than modern humans, possibly allowing easier births, but at the cost of some walking efficiency. One quirky or fringe fact to listen. A faint laugh of history reminds you of a folk claim that hanging upside down daily could lubricate the joints. A hopeful, if misguided, bit of body maintenance mythology. Historians still argue whether the narrowness of the modern pelvis is the result of climatic adaptation for heat dissipation or purely a gait-related efficiency upgrade. The truth, as always, shows signs of both. You pause at the hallway's exit, looking back over the shadows of knees, hips, vessels, and hollows, and feel a quiet awe. Every part is a negotiation, and you're the beneficiary and the victim, all in one body. Ahead, you can already sense the next chamber, holding yet more of these invisible bargains. Waiting for you to step inside, you step into the next chamber, and immediately the ceiling lowers, not enough to force you to crouch, but enough to make you aware of your posture. It's as though the space wants you to remember the shape of your own frame, to notice the subtle adjustments your muscles and joints make with every shift in terrain. To your left, suspended in a delicate frame, floats a human shoulder joint, a ball in a shallow socket, wrapped in sinew. It's the most mobile joint you own. You can reach behind your back, stretch overhead, throw, climb, but that same freedom means instability. A misjudged catch or awkward fall can pop the ball from its home. Repeated strain can fray the tendons that anchor it. Evolution gave you a shoulder fit for hunters and gatherers. Office chairs and smartphone scrolling were never part of its plan. Along the right wall runs a ribbon-like structure, a projection of your digestive tract unspooled like a map. This winding tunnel can extract nutrients from almost anything you eat, a marvel of chemical processing, and yet it's long, slow, and occasionally prone to rebellion, cramps, ulcers, blockages. Your gut is both a lifeline and a liability, a place where the microscopic lives within you. Bacteria, fungi, archaea hold as much sway over your well-being as you do. A smaller alcove, a head glows with a gentle amber light. Inside is a human hand again, but this time clenched around nothing. A reminder that, while grip strength once meant holding tools or weapons for survival, it now often means hours curled around a pen, a mouse, or a phone, postures that strain tendons and compressed nerves. Even the triumph of the opposable thumb comes at a cost: arthritis, repetitive strain, carpal tunnel syndrome. Past the alcove, you discover an odd projection of two human ankles rotating in an endless loop, designed for balance and movement. They're narrow pillars for everything above. Step wrong, and they twist ligaments, tearing with more force than you'd think possible in such a small joint. Ankles are the quiet heroes of every step you've ever taken, and the silent saboteurs of more falls and sprains than you care to remember. One mainstream fact to listen. You recall that human ankles, despite their vulnerability, are uniquely adapted for endurance walking and running, more stable forward than sideways. A trade-off that favors migration and persistence over sudden sprints and dodges. One quirky or fringe fact to listen. A whisper from the past tells of a Victorian belief that wearing copper bracelets could strengthen joints and ward off aches. A charm still sold and still debated. Today, historians still argue whether our frequent modern joint problems are mostly the fault of evolutionary compromise, or the mismatch between ancestral activity levels and sedentary lifestyles. Most agree it's a combination, though the scales tip differently depending on which bones you study. You leave the chamber with a growing sense of just how many of your miracles run on borrowed time, performing brilliantly right up until the moment they don't. And ahead, the corridor opens once more, as if inviting you to face the largest compromises of all. You walk forward into a space that feels both grand and unsettling. Tall ceilings, cool echoes, and in the center, a suspended frame that holds you, not all of you, in detail, but an abstracted silhouette made of glowing lines, every compromise lit like a constellation. The chest expands and contracts slowly, reminding you that even your breath is a trade-off. Lungs optimized for air, not for the depths of the sea where other mammals can dive for an hour. You can sprint on land, but you will never outbreath a seal underwater, circling the figure. You find the brain again, not just in its commanding glory, but as a reminder of its fragility. Enlargement of this organ gave you language, planning, art, but it also gave you a head so big at birth that it forced evolution to deliver babies earlier and more helpless than most mammals. Brains also overheat, misfire, and age in uncomfortable ways, leaving you with both genius and decline. Built into the same 3 pounds of tissue, further in, there's a slowly rotating spine threaded with silver light. Upright posture freed your hands, raised your eyes, and locked you into a geometry that strains vertebrae, discs, and soft tissues far beyond what a quadruped endures. In the skeletal glow, you notice small stress fractures highlighted along the base, as if to remind you that gravity is always winning a long, patient game. To the left, a glowing network of arteries pulses gently. It's a marvel of supply, delivering nutrients and oxygen to wherever they're most needed. But it's also an open target for plaque and rupture. Its constant pressure quietly wearing at the very walls that keep you alive, built for an active, leaner life. It now strains under modern abundance. At the far end, you find something you didn't expect, a curved series of translucent ribs, each one etched with faint marks. These marks tell a story in reverse, breaks healed at odd angles, tiny microscars of overextension, signs of repeated strain. The skeleton beneath your skin carries a ledger of every compromise your life has demanded. The fall you caught yourself from, the repetitive lift you once did without thinking, the posture you've held too long. One mainstream fact to listen. You recall reading that the modern human gestation period is thought to be limited not only by pelvis size, but also by the mother's metabolic capacity, the point at which sustaining both herself and the growing fetus becomes untenable. One quirky or fringe fact to listen. Somewhere in the dim, a whisper drifts past of early Arctic explorers who believed eating the brains of certain animals could pass on warmth or endurance. Folklore stitched to survival instinct, historians still argue whether brain expansion was an inevitable consequence of tool use or a rare evolutionary fluke amplified by chance. Both theories hold water, and neither quite satisfies. You leave the glowing silhouette behind, feeling a strange blend of awe and weariness. Every step you take is through the middle of an ancient negotiation, not perfection, not disaster, but the exact kind of good enough that has kept you moving through deep time. And beyond the doorway ahead, you suspect still more compromises are waiting, whispering that the balance was never perfect and never needed to be. You pause at the threshold of a darker hall, and the air feels different here, thinner, like the space is holding its breath for a long story it can't tell all at once. This is where accidents live. Not the dramatic kind with sirens, but the quiet, statistical ones, the roll of genetic dice that decided your eye color, your tolerance for milk, the little bend in your pinky, the way caffeine either lifts or rattles you. You step forward and realize the floor is a mosaic of small, irregular stones, each one a chance event set in place by time. You try not to trip. On the left wall, faint constellations glow, not stars, but gene frequencies mapped like night skies. You recognize nothing specific, only patterns, clusters where a trait is common, sparse fields where it's rare, places where a flood of migration washed certain variants thin and left others behind. This is genetic drift, the way traits can rise and fall, not because they're good or bad, but because people lived, loved, died, and didn't leave the same number of children. You rub your fingertips together as if you could feel drift like sand. You can't, but it's still under everything. A narrow window opens in the wall, showing a slow-motion scene. A tiny band of people crossing a wind-scraped ridge, heads bowed against cold. You catch that they're not representative of the population they left, a few families, not a village, a handful of traits, not the whole palette. This is a founder effect, where a small group carries forward a biased sample of the original genetic deck and deals it to a new place. Maybe they have a higher frequency of a rare enzyme variant. Maybe they happen to share a quirk in a collagen gene. None of them knows that in a few centuries, a statistic will be carved into the bones of their descendants. Another window flickers. This one is tighter, claustrophobic, a disaster, a bottleneck. Not apocalyptic, just cruel enough to squeeze numbers down so low that random outcomes become destiny. After the storm passes, disease, drought, conflict, the survivors' gene variants are suddenly the new normal, not because they were superior, but because they were present. You watch the scene widen like a breath being taken after a long dive, and you understand why chance can masquerade as design when you only look at the present. You drift deeper, and the corridor blooms into a gallery of faces. Not portraits, exactly, but composites, each one shifting subtly as you look at it. A child's face becomes a grandmother's for an instant. A stranger's grin flashes into someone you once knew. It's a reminder that inherited traits mix unpredictably, polygenic scores running around like children in a park, kicking up dust that settles into eye hues, skin tones, hair textures, and bone angles. You can predict the range. You can't predict the precise face looking back until it's already here. The floor softens underfoot, not carpet, but a densely woven fabric like a tapestry. You kneel and examine it, strands labeled with names, drift, selection, migration, mutation, braided together so tightly it's hard to tell where one begins or ends. You place a hand on the strand called mutation, and it pulses faintly. Most changes are neutral or harmful. A few become gifts. Many are simply odd. Those odd ones can persist if they hitch themselves to a population bent by chance. Sometimes they tag along for centuries, like odd luggage that nobody opens. You straighten and find yourself facing a dim alcove, housing a simple object, a jawbone with a crowded row of teeth. The inscription you can't quite read still makes its point. Impacted molars are not a story of one villainous gene, but a tangle of drift, diet changes, and skull reshaping riding on growth timelines. If your wisdom teeth never erupted, thank a series of unrelated decisions made by ancestors who never met. Their separate paths converging in your jaw, like traffic merging into a single lane. Across from the jawbone is a long glass ribbon with wave-like markings, an animation of a trait's frequency quivering over centuries. You step close and realize it's tracking lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk sugar into adulthood. In some places and times, a cultural shift dairying turned a rare variant into a common one, not because it made anyone inherently better, but because people who could drink cow's milk during lean seasons had one more way to bridge a bad harvest. Elsewhere, lactase persistence didn't catch on, and perfectly healthy bodies stuck to the ancestral plan, milk for infants, not for grown-ups. The wave rises and falls, depending on who stayed, who left, who thrived, who didn't. Culture and chance hold hands and call it destiny. A small, almost shy display waits in the corner, a scatter of eye colors, with blue shimmering like shallow water. You realize blue didn't sweep across populations because it's universally superior. It floated, faltered, expanded, where small groups carried it onward, where drift was kind, where preferences, perhaps, nudged the probabilities. Blue persisted for reasons as mundane as winter sun, and as human as who found whom beautiful. In a dim, firelit room, light finds a way to make meaning out of randomness, and so do people. As you walk on, the hall opens into a long, low chamber, lined with shelves bearing objects from daily life, a hand tool, a dried plant, a scrap of woven cloth, each with a tag describing a population that carried it into a new climate, a new season, a new set of pathogens. The bodies changed a little, then a little more, skin melanin adjusting to different sunlight, noses narrowing or widening with humidity and temperature, limbs lengthening or shortening with cold or heat. Selection whispers inside these changes. But drift speaks, too, sometimes louder than anyone notices. If the group was small, if the winters were harsh, if the births came in clusters, random chance walked right into the next generation and made itself at home. You sense a murmur behind you and turn to find a thin door you missed before. It opens on a cramped stairwell, spiraling upward. Each step is labeled with an event, a drought, a migration, a valley settling, a port town rising, and beside each is a little slate with a fraction scratched into it. These are not moral scores, they are probabilities. Anyone who lived through them became tomorrow by surviving, not by being perfect. The sums were never fair, they were just real at the top of the stairs. A narrow landing looks out over a model landscape, and you see how little it takes to change everything. A river moving its course by a kilometer, a forest thinning after a dry decade, a bridge built across an inlet, trade routes bloom and wither, people meet or don't, traits blend or don't, and all of it becomes someone's medical chart 1,000 years later. A nerve that pinches more easily in one lineage, a hip angle that loves marathons in another, a shoulder that dislocates more in a third, each with a story that reads like intention but was written by terrain and time-shuffling cards. You descend a different stair, quieter, into a chamber filled with transparent crates, each holding a flicker of light. You realize each light is a reproductive story, a mother and child, a father and child, a pair who couldn't conceive, a newborn who didn't live, a midwife arriving in time, a winter too long, a herb that helped the survival of any trait. Rests on these infinitesimal outcomes, stacked into a tower that could topple at any moment. Drift doesn't care what the crates contain, it only counts them. You can't help feeling a little haunted and a little grateful for every flicker that led to you. A narrow corridor opens from the crates into a small, serene room. On a pedestal rests a simple human vertebra, a single disc, familiar now after all the corridors of spines and aches. But this one is engraved with a fine lattice, like frost on a window. You pick it up, it's an impression, not a bone, cold and oddly heavy. On its underside, a small line of text. You don't need to read it to know what it says. Fragile in some families, resilient in others, and not always for reasons anyone can predict. A single drought centuries ago might have nudged a tiny cluster of genes that made bone thin slightly more likely in a group that then grew large. It wasn't fate, it was arithmetic. You set the disc back and watch the frost lattice slowly fade and reform like breath on glass. You realize that even the bad traits you carry aren't purely bad. They're attached to histories that also carried you this far. A susceptibility to one illness might have shadowed a different advantage. A brittle something might be bound to a keen something else. The tapestry refuses simple labels in the next space. A long table displays tools of modern life: a bicycle helmet, a water filter, a prenatal vitamin, a vaccine vial, and each object casts a shadow on the wall behind it in the shape of an older catastrophe now mostly averted. Where chance once had a clearer path to shape genomes by thinning populations, culture and technology have blocked some routes, widened others, and built bridges where cliffs once stood. The dice are still rolling, but the table they're rolling on is different. You drift along the table until you reach a small open notebook with blank pages. A pencil lies across it. You expect words to appear, some tidy conclusion about what drift means for the design you're wearing. Nothing writes itself. You understand the story is real, but it doesn't decide your worth. It doesn't predict your best day or your worst. It only explains why your body can be a mosaic of excellence, an annoyance of lucky breaks and odd debts paid to people long gone. You leave the notebook open, walk to the far wall, and push through a curtain of bead-like lights that clink softly, like rain against a window. On the other side is a corridor, even quieter than the rest, muted, upholstered, the way a theater feels when a late show ends. Here, shelves hold objects you recognize, not as parts of anatomy, but as echoes of events: a polished river stone, a dried fig, a sliver of charcoal from an old fire ring, a shard of pale pottery. The tags are brief: a camp by a bend, a winter, stock of fruit, a hearth that burned out, a bowl that broke. Somehow, these small things altered who met whom, who stayed, who left, and therefore who appears in your face today. Drift doesn't need grand conspiracies. It needs only the math of small lives. At the end of the hushed hall, you find a window with a view that isn't a view. A slow-motion panorama of faces across centuries blending into one another, and then into yours in the reflection. You raise a hand, testing the mirror for a seam, and the face raises a hand back. There are lines you know you got from your parents, and lines that no one living can claim. Between them are traces smudged by the hands of chance: a softened jawline, a freckle map, a quirk in cartilage, a tendon that hums after long runs, a back that forgives poor chairs until one Tuesday it doesn't. You stand there longer than you meant to, until the window dims and your reflection gentles into shadow. You turn away and let your fingers trail along the wall, not to steady yourself, but as if touching the fabric of all those accidents might soften their edge. They don't soften, they don't sharpen either. They simply are. You step onward, into a space that feels like the deepest room yet. A chamber arranged like a courtroom, but without a judge. A single chair waits in the center, under a pale circle of light. You sit, and in the silence you sense arguments that have been made here 1,000 times. This trait is maladaptive. This one is genius. This one is vestigial. This one is destiny. The air is warm with the echo of opinions. You finally realize there's no verdict coming, because the gallery isn't arranged for punishment or praise. It's arranged for perspective. You stand. The light dissolves, and the chamber opens into a long, descending ramp edged with faint handrails. You walk down slowly, and the ramp hums as if alive, like it's giving back some of the energy you spend. At the bottom, a door slides aside, and you step through into a gentler dark, the kind that feels like the inside of a held breath. Somewhere ahead, there's the rustle of the next turn in the story. Not selection's sharp blade, not design's blueprint, but the hushed roll of random outcomes that somehow assembled into a body that laughs, aches, learns, and sleeps. You touch your sternum lightly and feel your own heart move once beneath your fingertips, an old drum keeping time in a hall full of accidents. Then you take one more step forward into the deeper quiet that has always been waiting for you. You let that deeper quiet settle around you for a moment, the way you might stop in a forest to listen for sounds you can't name. It's not empty. Here, there's a hum you can't place, the low vibration of all the random inheritances you carry. And as you walk forward, the darkness lightens into a pale, silvery glow, like moonlight caught in water. This new hall is lined with long, shallow basins, each one filled with translucent layers, like rings inside a tree. You step closer to the first and realize the layers aren't wood, they're time. Each thin band is a generation, each faint shift in color a small genetic reshuffling. In some bands, a rare trait appears like a sudden bright seam, only to fade again a few rings later. In others, the same seam spreads outward until the basin glows with the color. That's drift again, working slowly, invisibly, turning a coin toss into a signature written in a population's face, hands, or bones. The second basin holds something sharper, jagged, lightning-like insertions between the bands, mutations. Most are faint, harmless ripples in the sequence. A few blaze bright and wide, forcing every ring above them to adjust subtly to accommodate their presence. You remember that these changes weren't chosen and didn't happen for anything. They simply happened, like a spark catching in dry grass. Whether they smolder out or reshape a forest depends on chance, the environment, and how many carriers walk past that spark into the next century. You continue down the row, and the basins shift their metaphor. One shows human stature over millennia, the bands gently rising and falling, a few centimeters gained here, lost there, not because bodies were striving for an ideal height, but because food supply, disease load, and resource availability tugged on growth like a tide. Sometimes shorter bodies thrived. Sometimes taller ones had the advantage. In the glow, you can see outlines of real people, all the strangers who unknowingly voted with their lives for which direction the trend leaned at the far end. You find a basin that doesn't hold ancestral data at all, but a shimmering reflection of you. Your outline is scattered with tiny glints, like stars across skin. These are your own personal set of statistical artifacts, traits that arrived, stayed, or left in your lineage not because of grand strategy, but because someone, somewhere in your past, simply was, while someone else, elsewhere, simply wasn't. You run a hand across the surface. The reflection shivers and steadies again. The wall beyond curves and leads you into a more intimate alcove. No basins here, just shelves of small glass jars. In each floats a single object, a lock of hair, a carved bead, a snapped arrowhead, a fishhook smoothed by river water. Beside each is a quiet label: migration, isolation, storm loss, festival meeting. You understand without needing the full sentences. These were the moments when people met or didn't, when one pairing happened and another didn't, when all the messy business of survival brushed against the roll of chance. That brush left fingerprints on you. One mainstream fact to listen. You remember that after the eruption of Mount Toba, about 74,000 years ago, human populations may have faced a severe bottleneck, with some genetic evidence suggesting our ancestors were reduced to small, scattered groups. If true, entire sequences in your genome carry the echo of that narrowing. One quirky or fringe fact to listen. A faint, amused whisper here recalls an old superstition in parts of Europe that a child born during a thunderstorm would have a distinct streak of white in their hair. Most of the time, that omen was probably poliosis pigment loss in a patch of hair arriving through genes, not lightning. Historians still argue whether the Toba bottleneck truly shaped modern human diversity or whether its genetic signal is smaller than once believed. The evidence is as clouded as volcanic ash settling over centuries. You step out of the alcove and find the corridor ahead narrowing again, but not in menace, more like it wants to usher you toward something concentrated. A single scene where all these threads of randomness come together without pretending to be a design. The air smells faintly metallic, like rain on stone. And you know you're about to hear another story that's been humming under your skin all along. You move into the tighter space, fingertips brushing the cool wall as the sound beneath your feet changes. It's no longer the muted hum of polished stone, but the faint crunch of gravel under a thin layer of dust. The hall bends slightly, revealing a single display ahead, a circular table scattered with objects of wildly different shapes and origins. Some are organic, a fragment of bone, an ancient seed husk, a feather dulled by time. Others are crafted, a bronze clasp, a chipped ceramic bead, an ivory die carved with pips worn almost smooth. You realize these are all tokens of contingency, things that, in their time, altered human paths just enough to leave a thread in your own genetic weave. That ivory die wasn't just a game piece. Perhaps it sat in the hand of someone who survived a famine by winning a gamble over food. The seed husk might mark an attempt to plant a non-native crop, reshaping diets and, over generations, digestive enzymes. Even that dulled feather, it may belong to a bird whose migratory path led hunters into a new valley, where a chance meeting between two strangers sparked a line that eventually wound down to you. You circle the table slowly. The randomness here isn't reckless, it's intimate. Each object holds a story small enough to fit in a pocket, but powerful enough to echo for millennia. This, you think, is how luck hides, not in big battles and decisive victories, but in the tiny arrangements of being in the right or wrong place at the right or wrong time. From the far wall, you hear a soft ticking, at first like a clock, but not quite regular. You follow the sound to a tall, narrow cabinet with glass doors. Inside are hundreds of hourglasses, each filled with different grains, sand, salt, ash, even tiny seeds. They run at mismatched speeds, some in steady streams, some in fits and starts. Above them, faint labels, note pairings, drought and birth, migration and sickness, trade and love, war and shelter. Each hourglass is one coincidence cascading into another. one, near the top, catches your eye. Its grains are a pale blue. The label simply reads, "Winter Marriage, Year Without Summer." You imagine it, a cold snap in a year when crops failed, forcing families together indoors, perhaps accelerating unions and births. Those children, born into lean times, carried both the strain and the subtle genetic lessons of that year down the chain. And here you are, touching glass, feeling the faint hum of that improbable equation. You step back. The ticking fades as the cabinet doors close silently, and the hall opens into a softer light. Suspended in this glow are faint holograms of hands, taking hands, passing objects, clasping shoulders in greeting or farewell. You notice how often the hands don't match, different skin tones, ages, shapes, scars. These are the invisible gates where genetic mixing happens, sometimes widening diversity, sometimes narrowing it in pockets. One mainstream fact to listen: you recall that the peopling of the Americas likely came from small founder groups, crossing the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age, carrying only a fraction of the genetic diversity of their source populations. That fraction still shapes traits today. One quirky or fringe fact to listen: you hear a playful echo of a belief from certain coastal villages that a child conceived during a strong ocean storm would inherit sea legs and never get seasick. Most likely drift and myth, bound together like rope. Historians still argue whether the initial genetic diversity of those early American settlers was higher than we think, perhaps replenished by multiple migration waves, or if it really did bottleneck sharply on that frozen land bridge. The archaeological record leaves enough gaps to keep the debate alive. The hologram hands fade, and the glow draws you toward another turn, and you can feel that the randomness here is about to dip into even stranger territory, where coincidence isn't just probable, it's inevitable. You follow that turn, and the floor beneath you becomes irregular again, not dangerous, but uneven in a way that makes you slow down. Each step feels like you're walking across the back of some sleeping giant, rolling gently below you. The walls glimmer faintly, and you see that they aren't made of stone anymore. They're a patchwork of overlapping images, each flickering in and out so quickly you can't catch them all. Faces, shells, a handful of seeds, a lightning strike, a line of snow-covered peaks. This is the inevitability room where randomness doesn't just happen. It has to happen. The more you look, the more you realize, given enough time, certain outcomes are practically guaranteed. Not because they're planned, but because probability eventually insists on them. A trait appears in one place, disappears, and reappears somewhere else centuries later, not through design, but because the math of reproduction is an endless reel that sometimes repeats the same frame. On your left, you notice a shallow trough, filled with small, differently colored stones. They tumble slowly down a spiral channel, occasionally grinding together until one cracks or splinters. The fragments spin away, bouncing into new paths. The sign beside it doesn't name the stones. It just reads, "Mutations are inevitable. Their fates are not." You watch one fragment fall into a groove already polished by others, the same change, born separately in different bodies, separated by hundreds of years. Farther along is a large, slow-turning sphere, its surface glowing with branching, river-like lines. At certain points, tributaries merge, then split in strange ways. This is gene flow, and you trace it with your finger until you lose track, lost among detours and little dead-end creeks that never make it to the ocean. In some of those isolated pockets, a harmless quirk can swell into a local signature, a subtle curve of the nose, a frequency in blood type, a tendency in a joint's flexibility, carried forward because no other tributary ever washed it away. The sphere gently hums and tilts, revealing a hollow inside it. Projected, there are silhouettes of people dancing in a dimly lit place. You can't hear music, but you can almost feel the rhythm passing between them. Proximity, attraction, and timing weaving together in unpredictable pairings. That's another inevitability. Where people gather, they mix. Sometimes that mixing carries a life-saving allele into a storm. Sometimes it carries a vulnerability into a place it will never need to defend. On the right wall, you see a small case holding something that looks like a coin, but it's marked not with heads or tails. Instead, it says advantage on one side and liability on the other. You reach for it, but it's sealed behind glass. The display beneath explains without words. Many traits play both roles. The same genetic variant that helps in one landscape can harm in another. And across many landscapes, its ultimate meaning changes like the weather. One mainstream fact to listen. You think of the sickle cell trait, dangerous in double doses, protective against malaria in single ones, an enduring example of a gene's meaning changing entirely depending on the environment. One quirky or fringe fact to listen. Then, like a ripple of humor through the still air, you hear about an old belief in some mountain villages that twins were always a sign of luck in fishing, as if human reproduction could charm the catch, and the ocean would pay attention. Historians still argue whether the persistence of the sickle cell allele in high malaria regions is purely balanced selection, or if drift played a side role in keeping it anchored in certain small populations. The line between design and accident blurs easily here. You leave the inevitability room with a strange sense that you're not just the sum of accidents and adaptations, but also of all the events that simply became inevitable by being possible. And ahead, the next chamber feels warmer, as though it's holding a different kind of randomness, one touched more directly by human choice. You step into the warmer space, and immediately it feels different, less like the passive halls of quiet drift, more like a room where hands have been busy moving pieces on a board. Here, chance still plays its eternal dice game, but human choice has a way of nudging the table, tilting the odds, sometimes on purpose, sometimes by mistake. The walls are lined with shadow boxes containing scenes of decision, a path forked into two, a raft lashed together by rope, a cluster of clay pots filled with seed grain. Each decision rings like a small bell that will echo for generations in bones, blood, and lungs, settling near a river or on higher ground, marrying inside the village, or finding a partner from 2 days' walk away, choosing to stay and plant barley or following the herds over the ridge. Each is a subtle vote in evolution's silent council. One display shows a group sharing a cooked meal around a low fire. That simple act, repeated thousands of times, changed teeth, jaws, and guts over centuries. Cooking softened food, altered caloric intake, and allowed survival on otherwise unwelcoming landscapes. The genes that thrived here weren't the best. They were simply those that allowed people to make use of what was on the plate. The genetic nudge wasn't deliberate, but the choice to roast or boil instead of chew raw carried the influence. You walk further and see another box, this one showing a family moving inland, away from the marsh where they'd always lived. The marsh-born immune quirks that defended them from wetland parasites might fade over time in dry country, replaced slowly by other strengths, other weaknesses. A pure accident, but shaped by a deliberate relocation. A low hum draws you to a long counter holding dozens of small vials. The plaques below them read like travel itineraries: Salt Road Crossing, Harbor Trade, Mountain Pass Wedding, Slave Ship Manifest. Some vials shimmer with promise, representing the mixing of once separated lineages that brought new combinations of disease, resistance, metabolism, and appearance. Others hold subtler shifts, a blending that introduced vulnerabilities alongside advantages. Humans made the choices to travel, trade, and take, but the biological consequences followed their own rules. At the end of the counter, you find a wide, shallow basin of clear water with tiny ripples spreading across its surface. Above it hangs a sign, asterisk, choice begins the ripple, chance carries it to shore. Asterisk, you dip your fingers in and the ripples bend, weaving together with older ones that fade into the shimmer. That's how intentions, good, bad, or indifferent, meet probability. One mainstream fact to listen. You think of how the spread of agriculture out of the Fertile Crescent reshaped not just diets, but bodies, altering stature, dental health, and disease exposure through a mix of cultural choice and environmental chance. One quirky or fringe fact to listen. A playful memory surfaces of an old belief that eating the heart of a swift animal would give a child its speed. For generations, families may have acted on such myths, shaping nothing directly, yet still folding their choices into the endless shuffle of genetic cards. Historians still argue how much of early agricultural DNA change was driven by intentional crop-keeping choices versus the incidental drift of small founding farmer groups. Both happen invisibly, while fields grow and seasons turn. You leave the room thinking about how quickly choice can become chance, and how easily chance can masquerade as choice when you look backward. Ahead, the corridor begins to slope downward, as if guiding you to the very roots of where your accidents and inheritances first took hold. You ease into a broader hall where the air brightens just enough for you to notice a different feeling in your shoulders, something like relief or maybe recognition. After all that talk of compromises and frayed edges, this room wants you to remember that your body isn't just a patchwork of problems. It's also a vault of miracles that behave like they've been rehearsing for ages. The light here doesn't glare. It glows the way morning slides across a room and makes everything ordinary look like it has a secret. You take a step and hear that barely there hush of your own gait, the quiet roll from heel to toe that wastes so little energy it's almost smug about it. You forget, most days, that walking is a superpower, not dramatic like flight, but relentless, efficient, a tiny miracle repeated thousands of times without ceremony. Your feet tarches tuned like subtle spring store and release energy on every step so the world becomes just a touch lighter whenever you decide to cross it. You don't think of it as extraordinary, but that's what true excellence looks like in a body. It feels normal. On your left, a wall unfurls with moving silhouettes of hands in slow motion, turning pages without crinkling them, tying knots, without glancing down, cracking an egg so gently the yolk hangs in the air like a small sun. Dexterity isn't just flexibility. It's a symphony of nerve timing, tendon glide, and muscle whisper, all conducted by a brain that knows the difference between pressure and force, like a poet knows the difference between almost and enough. You can split a pill, thread a needle, or tap a rhythm that makes someone across the room smile without knowing why. Tools didn't make your hands clever. Your hands and brain made tools inevitable. You drift deeper, and the temperature feels perfect. Not warm, not cool. Just right in that way that only happens when a house has been held at comfort for hours. That's your thermoregulation. At work, the quiet arithmetic of sweat and blood flow, of vessels opening like doors and closing like shutters, of skin turning into a smooth, silent radiator. It's not cinematic. It just keeps you alive in rooms and seasons that swing from chilly to stifling. Stand still in a hot wind and you become an evaporative engine. Move under a bright sun and your whole surface begins to manage heat like a practiced stagehand, invisible and indispensable. Across the hall is a slow, looping ribbon of breath. Inhale, exhale, stretching into a horizon. You forget how elegantly your body unspools oxygen into nearly every cell, picking it up in the lungs and handing it off like a relay where no baton ever drops. The hemoglobin in your blood doesn't merely carry oxygen. It courts it, lures it, on board in the lungs, then lets it go in needy tissues with a temperature and acidity-sensitive grace that would make an engineer go quiet. The miracle isn't that this happens once. It's that it happens always, even while you sleep, even while you worry, even while you're not paying attention. You pause near a still pool of light that holds the outline of a face, not detailed, just enough to catch what matters. White sclera around dark pupils, the bright contrast that makes it easy to follow someone's gaze. It's a simple trick with enormous consequences. You can see where another person is looking from across a room. Guess what they're thinking before they speak. Share attention without saying a word. Those white crescents gave language a head start and made cooperation feel like a reflex. It's a quiet superpower, eyes that talk even when mouths are silent. You walk on, and there's the faint click of tendons as your ankles reset, the soft thud of blood in your ears when you climb a gentle slope, the silky slide of saliva priming. The entire digestive orchestra the moment you smell toast. You've been living with these invisible pilots for so long that you mistake them for background noise. They're not background, they're the show. You find a small alcove where a model of the human larynx hangs like a delicate instrument. Strings, frame, bellows. It doesn't look like music, but it is. Breath rises, folds, vibrate. Resonance chambers in your throat and mouth shape wave into word. And somehow meaning rides, sound like a swallow rides air. You've asked for help, told jokes, made promises, and soothed storms with this device. And you'll keep doing it, usually without thinking about the cleverness involved. Sing on a long drive, whisper in the dark. These are luxuries purchased by 1,000 tiny adjustments inside a narrow space you almost never see. You turn, and the hall opens into a long gallery bordered by displays of motion. A slow runner passes you on a projection to the right, shoulders relaxed, stride efficient. You can almost feel the tendons storing elastic energy with each foot strike, returning it with a spring that makes distance feel less like punishment and more like patience. True, sprinting might not be the human headline, but sustained movement in the heat, that's your niche. It's not just biology, it's choreography perfected by practice. A body rehearsing its part until performance and breath are the same thing. On a quiet shelf near the floor sits a model, heart, 4 chambers, valves that open and close like tiny doors in an old city, blood rushing through in ordered loops. It's not a flawless pump, it's better, a reliable one. It lasts decades on wet chemistry and trust, adjusting with a whispered signal when stairs appear or a memory hurts more than expected. When it stumbles, the rest of you reaches to steady it. Vessels dilate, breathing shifts, hormones tip. The teamwork is invisible, which is the only reason it looks ordinary. You stop in front of a recessed panel displaying a shimmering net, neurons branching and branching again. Each endpoint a small flicker of light. It's so dense it feels like a forest fire in slow motion. This is the part that cannot be overpraised without immediately sounding foolish. A brain that can imagine a future, rehearse mistakes before they happen, and rewrite entire plans between breakfast and lunch. It learns a language late. It calms itself on purpose. It tells itself a bedtime story that makes sleep come sooner. It also, yes, misplaces keys and forgets birthdays, but that's the price of being built for novelty. Brilliance that tolerates error because it needs the freedom to try. You step back and let the net's glow settle your eyes until the afterimage becomes a soft blur. When it fades, the hall feels larger, as if recognizing that excellence in a body isn't found in any one place, it's in the handoff between places. The baton passed 1,000 times a minute, never quite dropped, only occasionally fumbled, and recovered before anyone notices. Now the floor shifts, just enough to guide you toward a quieter alcove with a glass bell jar. Inside is a tiny, moving scene, a fingertip healing, a cut closes, blood gels, a scab forms, new tissue stitches itself together, collagen knits, color returns. You did nothing. The system did everything. Imperfect, sometimes overzealous, occasionally scar-prone, and still astonishing. Your warranty may be limited, but the repair manual is always open. You listen, and somewhere, under the hum, you can make out another sound, a faint rustle like pages turning. It's memory, filing away today in case tomorrow needs a reminder. Smells go into one folder. Lessons learned the hard way go into another. Some pages get misfiled, that's normal, but most of the time, the right drawer opens when you reach for it. Recall isn't perfect. It's practical. It optimizes your present, not an imaginary database. You touch your forearm and feel the tiny shift of hairs, the light pressure that tells you you're real, here, intact. Those sensors report constantly, telling you how to sit, when to shift, whether the tea is too hot, whether the breeze is enough. The report is so constant that absence feels alarming. A foot that goes numb, a hand asleep, and unfamiliar. The gift is awareness, continually refreshed and politely withdrawn when it's not needed, so your mind can wander and make up stories about rooms like this one. You round a bend and find a display so simple you almost miss it. A glass of water, a pinch of salt, a curve of lemon. The sign beside it doesn't brag. It just says homeostasis. You drink a little more when you sweat, crave salt when you've lost too much, choose sour when you need a wake-up nudge. You're a walking set of feedback loops held within narrow ranges that forgive your experiments and rescue you from your indulgences more often than you deserve. This is not perfection. It's a stable relationship with chaos. Ahead, there's a narrow doorway framed by two small plaques. One reads, "The hacks you notice." The other, "The superpowers you never do." You step through, and the room beyond is almost empty, just a bench and a view of nothing in particular. That's the point. The best parts of your body are the ones quiet enough to be ignored, dependable enough that you can spend an entire evening thinking about constellations or soup recipes or the sound of rain while they keep you alive without demanding applause. You sit on the bench and let your shoulders drop. Your jaw loosens. A slow breath expands your ribs, and you feel the small lift at the top before the gentle fall. Your spine arranges itself into something kinder. Blood goes where it needs to go. 100 muscles adjust by fractions. 1,000 signals dart and fade. The room leans in, like it's listening to your silence, and your silence sounds like competence. One mainstream fact to listen. Picture the 3.6 million year old Laetoli footprints again. 2 or 3 individuals walking across fresh volcanic ash, stride lengths and foot arches, recorded like a signature. That quiet ecological ink says, endurance walking existed long before sidewalks and running shoes, and human locomotion was already a masterpiece written in pressure and balance. One quirky or fringe fact to listen, a little echo from old theater. Lore claims that gargling warm honey and lemon with a dash of olive oil could polish the voice before a performance, a ritual, equal parts placebo and comfort, yet a lovely nod to the larynx as a delicate instrument that loves warmth, hydration, and a little care. Historians still argue whether the conspicuous white sclera of human eyes evolved primarily for cooperative communication or emerged as a byproduct of other changes, later co-opted for social signaling. Either way, your eyes became billboards for attention, and attention became a shortcut to understanding. You stand, and the bench remembers your shape for a second before forgetting, the way rooms always do. The hall opens again, hinting at tools, not wrenches and hammers, but the objects you've made that compete with and complement your biology. Shoes that borrow from tendon springiness, lenses that extend your sight, utensils that leverage your grip, rhythms that coax your heart into steady work. Culture and body co-evolve, trading tips, swapping duties, covering for each other's weak spots, amplifying each other's strengths, so you walk toward that exchange, where your clever hands meet cleverer inventions, and you can almost taste the future on the air, not glossy or perfect, but generous, like a friend who shows up with exactly the right thing and says, "Here, try this, it might help." You step into that exchange where clever hands meet clever tools, and the light shifts from warm to a gentle workshop glow, the kind you'd expect over a bench where someone tinkers late into the night. It feels right because your body's best tricks are tinkerers at heart. Nothing here was designed from scratch. Everything was refit, borrowed, upgraded, patched, improved just enough to matter, and never so much that the whole machine had to stop. On the nearest table sits a simple pair of shoes, battered, laces frayed. You pick them up and feel an odd kinship with the tendons in your feet. The shoes are only pretending to help. The real spring is in you. Your plantar fascia hums along each step, arch rising and falling like a quiet tide. The shoes amplify what your tissue already knows how to do: store a sip of energy and give it back without complaint. You slip them down and step forward, and the movement feels like a proof of concept for your entire species. Partnership between fabric and flesh. To your left, a slender rack holds reading glasses in a tidy row. You try one pair on, then another, and the world snaps into crisp lines. The lenses aren't replacing your eyes, they're collaborating with them. The white sclera still flags your gaze to anyone paying attention. The iris still opens and closes. At the news of light, the glasses simply smooth a hiccup in the shape of the eye so that your internal superpowers can get back to work. Collaboration, that's the theme. The device is an invitation, and your biology accepts across the room. A small loop of film plays an old scene, a runner loosening shoulders, shaking out legs, lowering into an easy stride as a dusty road opens. There's a day-old sun high in the sky and a heat that would test most mammals. But there's your skin, 1,000 tiny radiators, and your breath, your pace, your sweat, the shade, the breeze. You're a moving microclimate, balancing equations in real time, salts out, fluids in, heat traded for evaporation. The run looks effortless because the negotiation is invisible. You don't see the blood vessels opening at the surface, the heart adjusting its cadence, the brain approving the budget. You only see a body cruising through heat like it understands summer better than summer understands itself. You drift onward and pause at a humble, gleaming tool, a spoon. It's nothing, and yet it's everything. Never could without burns. In that small arc of metal, your body's intelligence is reflected back. Build tools that respect your joints, that match the thumb's leverage and the wrist's arc, that catch and carry so the jaw and tongue can sort taste from texture without urgency. Tools that know the choreography of the body are love letters to anatomy. A soft chime turns your head toward a wall of slow, pulsing light, a heart monitor tracing peaceful hills. The line is steady, unhurried, with small variations that say, you're alive and paying attention, not metronomic and mechanical. The heart's superpower isn't speed or strength. It's responsiveness. Stand, and it rises a little. Sit, and it realigns. Fear nudges it. Calm invites it down. It listens more than it speaks, even when machines join the conversation. A cuff squeezing your arm, a watch taking your pulse. The heart keeps doing what it has always done. Negotiate with a day, not just survive it. You pivot toward a low cabinet set with drawers like a map chest. You pull one open and find a collection of bones arranged by function, levers, pivots, arch supports, shock distributors. Each one sits beside a tiny placard explaining the mechanical trick it performs in concert with your muscles and tendons. The patella isn't just a kneecap, a doorknob, and holding a bowl steady. The pelvis isn't just a cradle. It's a load-bearing ring that roots forces around a vulnerable center. This is the language your bones speak, not of fragility, but of shrewdness. In the next drawer are nerves braided like delicate cables. A note says, reroute here, shortcut there, redundancy wherever possible, speed where necessary. You imagine a relay team that never meets in person, only hands off batons in precise timing. Messages race from fingertip to spinal cord to brain and back again faster than you can decide to decide. You don't command most of it, you benefit from it. The nervous system's quiet superpower is delegation, reflex here, habit there, conscious thought only where it matters, and not for long. If the system demanded your attention for every spark, you'd never leave the house. You close the drawer and notice a small, upright mirror perched on a stand. It shows your face, but the light is soft enough to make it kinder than the bathroom version. You lean in, and your pupils flare just slightly. In that tiny adjustment is a world, a muscle iris flexing, a brain calculating available photons, a lens reshaping marginally, an eye living in a constant conversation with light. And there, at the margins, the sclera, again, bright and obvious, telling anyone nearby where your attention sits. This is the trick that lets you read a room in silence, that lets a child know you're looking at them and not the window, that lets a friend catch a joke mid-sentence. If you could hear the language of glances, and you feel your calves quietly take on the grade. The Achilles tendon stretches and stores, then releases. Your hips stabilize with tiny, barely there activations. You think, this is why stairs feel good on days when nothing else does. The choreography wakes up, the springs remember their job, and the joints find their natural rhythm. It's not exercise as punishment, it's rehearsal as pleasure. The incline levels into a room with a single display in the center, a sleeping figure. Rise and fall, rise and fall. You put a hand on the glass and feel the slow vibe of breath. Sleep seems passive, but it's one of your gilded hacks, glymphatic flow clearing waste from the brain. Hormones rebalancing, memory consolidating, immune patrols reorganizing. You go away and wake up returned, not new but repaired, not reborn but recalibrated. The miracle isn't that it happens after a perfect day, it's that it happens after a messy one. Your body forgives a lot if you just let it drift. You wander to a quiet corner where a small fountain babbles into a shallow basin. The plaque reads, hydration is strategy. You sip, and the body pivots gracefully. Kidneys adjust, blood volume steadies, saliva returns, temperature control smiles. You've felt this 1,000 times. The way a glass of water can turn a headache into a memory, a fog into a clearing. The trick isn't mystical, it's chemical, mechanical, electrical, a system that can be coaxed with a simple molecule, and will repay you by letting everything else work better. On a pedestal nearby is a loaf of bread and a bowl of beans, a nod to how your body can weave proteins from mixed sources, balance nutrients across days, borrow today and pay back tomorrow. Your gut doesn't just digest, it negotiates with a population of microbes living as tenants in your intestines. The microbiome whispers recipes to your immune system, coaches your metabolism, even nudges your mood. You're not a single organism. You're a cope, with very good common areas. That's not a flaw. It's a design feature grown from a million partnerships with the microscopic and the invisible. Past the pedestal, a curtain parts on a narrow lane lined with familiar objects: a bicycle, a jump rope, a yoga mat, a well-worn backpack. Each is an extension of your internal strengths. The bike bends the world in your favor, transforms legs into gliding machines, turns wind into a conversation partner, lets hearts settle into a tempo that feels like listening to a favorite song. The jump rope meshes timing, coordination, and breath into a childlike joy that doubles as conditioning. The mat is a negotiation platform for joints and fascia, a place to offer them space and get mobility in return. The backpack is a proof that a spine likes loads that move with it, not against it. You already know how to be strong. These things remind you how to be strong kindly. You slow as the lane ends at a small, high window. Through it, you see dusk, taking the edges off everything that blue hour, where even flaws look like texture. Your reflection appears faintly in the glass, and you notice the way your shoulders have dropped, how your jaw isn't clenched, how your breath has widened without you asking. This is another quiet superpower, a nervous system that can be invited down from its ledge by low light, slow sounds, and safe rooms. You aren't stuck with a single gear. You have a clutch, a brake, and a gentle accelerator, and you can learn when to use each dot. You turn from the window and come upon a small lectern holding a single card. It reads, "Excellence is often the absence of noise." You smile because you've been walking through that sentence for a while now, past feet that glide, joints that coordinate, skin that cools, eyes that speak, hands that solve, a heart that listens, a brain that rehearses, a gut that negotiates, and 1,000 tiny governors that know how to keep you in the lane where life feels doable. One mainstream fact to listen. Picture your hand's precision again, and remember that the human thumb's saddle joint, the carpo-metacarpal joint, enables opposition, that simple seeming motion, letting the thumb meet each fingertip, which is a mechanical foundation for tool use, writing, and the everyday grace of opening, pinching, turning, and tying. One quirky or fringe fact to listen. A soft echo of stage superstition drifts by some old radio. Hosts swore that placing a slice of apple under the tongue before going live brightened articulation. Science is thin. Hydration and practice do the heavy lifting. Still, the ritual is a charming bow to the instrument you carry in your throat. Historians still argue whether endurance running in humans is a dedicated adaptation, forged by persistence hunting, or a remarkable byproduct of broader locomotor efficiency, heat management, and social foraging. Either way, the outcome is the same. You're built to keep going, not in a blaze, but in a steady, generous burn. You leave the lectern, and the room relaxes behind you, like a lung at the end of an exhale. The corridor ahead curves with a welcoming gesture, as if to say, keep noticing what works, because that's how you learn to care for what doesn't. You take another step, heel to toe, spring to release, breath to blood, to thought, and the ordinary world feels a little more extraordinary for having been seen. You pause at the threshold as the light thins into a library, hush, not dusty, not stiff, but alive, with the quiet crackle of ideas colliding and then drifting apart like fireflies in slow motion. The walls are high and bare, except for faint outlines that appear and vanish, as if sketched in chalk and then wiped with a sleeve. A footprint, a feather, a jaw, a stone tool, a hip bone, a question mark. Declarations. You get invitations instead. A long table runs the length of the room, and on it lie objects arranged like a debate you can walk through. At one end, a single fossilized feather rests beside a lithograph of a curious skeleton with a long bony tail and teeth where beaks should be. You recognize the shape by rumor, if not by name, the early bird that wore a dinosaur's coat to dinner and then forgot to change. When you lean in, you can almost hear the argument that fossil ignited, not that evolution happens. The room accepts that as the floorboards beneath your feet, but that history is styled in transitions, not clean breaks, and that each discovery redraws the borderlines as if with a trembling hand. You straighten, and the feather's shadow lengthens. Like the memory of a fact that refuses to sit still, you move on and find a row of vertebrae, each a little different, knotted with the compromises of upright posture. One bears the delicate chiseling of a slipped disc's ghost. Another is pitted slightly, a nod to age, diet, luck. They look like arguments in bone. How much of this pain is a mismatch with modern chairs, and how much is the unavoidable tax of lifting a skull into the sky? The labels don't scold, they suggest, and you feel it, the tug-of-war between habits and hardware, neither entirely to blame, each quite capable of making the other look guilty. The table narrows to guide your attention. Here sits a pelvis, solid and troubling, a fulcrum for so many human stories. You can trace the hourglass tension, narrow enough to walk efficiently, wide enough to birth a big-brained infant, and you feel how scholars carry this object like a question they can't put down. You've heard the theories, the counter-theories, the careful sentences that begin with likely and never quite arrive at proved. You tilt the pelvis in your mind and watch two pictures overlay, one of long strides across open grass, one of a laboring body, breath measured, history poised at a threshold. The argument isn't cruel, it's tender and relentless. It asks, what story explains both pictures without pretending the world is simpler than it was? A glass case holds teeth from wide-shouldered molars to tidy incisors and a delicate jaw, with wisdom teeth curled like guests who turned up after all the seats were taken. The card whispers roads not taken, softer diets, shorter faces, tongues and palates pressed into new arrangements by fire and flour. You look for verdicts and find only balance, a blame-shared ledger, part culture, part chance, part trade-off that paid joy to some and pain to others. You can already hear a phrase you'll meet repeatedly in this room. Historians still argue, whether not because they enjoy confusion, but because the evidence refuses to snap into a single tidy frame. A small light draws you to a diorama of tools, not the glittering signatures of a genius species, but the incremental chorus of good enough flakes struck from stone, handles lashed to blades, fire coaxed into patience, threads woven from tough fibers. You trace the arc from hands to minds to hands again, a spiral tightening on itself. Did tool-making build brains, or did brain changes court the tools? You can feel the answer tug both ways, like two magnets trying to find each other through a sheet of glass. The room does not pick a side. It lets the tension hum. Because sometimes the hum is the truth. A turn of the table leads you past a skeleton whose shoulder girdle is subtly different, broader here, narrower there, and you're reminded that our lineage is not a single file but a braided river, channels dividing and rejoining, leaving backwaters and oxbow lakes where possibilities pooled and then dried. You pause at this thought because it loosens your grip on linear pride. The magnificent human body you carry is not the summit of a staircase. It's one of many ledges on a cliff face with lost paths, dead ends, and thrilling, terrifying traverses. The room asks you to honor them all, not just the ledge you're on. You reach a quiet alcove where a long limb bone lies beside a plaque with two voices carved into it, not names, just positions. One voice, endurance, running, honed us, shaped the spring of tendons and the persistence of breath. You can still track the geometry of that calling in your calves and arches. The other voice, endurance, was a grace note, not the melody. Walking made the world small, and in making it small, made it livable. You stand there and realize you don't have to choose a song to love the music. The road, a narrow shelf, holds artifacts that feel like contradictions. Wearing badges, a fragile ear built inside a skull that shouts, a spine that forgives 1,000 bends until the day it doesn't. A hand that can sew a wound and cause one with the same casual grip. The labels are gentle but pointed. Beware of stories that flatten complexity just to sleep better at night. The room prefers a restless honesty that lets you sleep for the right reasons. You cross to a window you didn't notice before, not an opening to the outside, but a pane of glass with a faint, shifting map behind it. Retreat. Forests appear and thin. Mountains wrinkle. Ice breathes in and out. Over this living terrain, pale paths sketch migrations that are not arrows so much as frayed ribbons. Advance, stall, return, detour. Under each ribbon, flickered traits that wax and wane without tidy morals. Noses narrow and widen. Skin shades deepen and lighten. Hair spirals or lies straight. Hips whisper with the geometry of cold or heat. Guts learn to savor or reject dairy. Someone will come later and craft slogans, but the room keeps the slogans outside. Inside, it keeps the signatures and the uncertainties side by side. A soft chime draws you to a lectern with a thin book open to a single page. The text is sparse, like instructions for a ritual that values the pauses. It reads, "Evidence is a lantern, not a floodlight." You smile at the simplicity and think of every time a new fossil or sequence or site has shown up, and everyone ran to turn the lantern toward their favorite corner. It's human, it's forgivable, and yet the room reminds you light is always smaller than the dark it reveals. And that's not a flaw. It's a condition of seeing. You move on, and an installation of 3 skulls waits in the next pool of light. One heavy-browed, one more rounded, one distinctly your era. They face one another like old friends who never met, their differences not insults but dialects. The placard's first line is a whisper you can barely hear. Convergence is common. Agreement is rare. The second line is clearer. Learn to love revisions. You do a little, or at least you're willing to try, to let go of the pride that wants the final draft, and accept that the margins of this book beg for pencil marks and sticky notes, and the occasional page torn out and replaced on a side table. A delicate chain of middle ear bones gleams like jewelry under glass, and next to it, a tiny placard tells a story of bones that used to be jaw, retooled and recruited into hearing. You can feel the debate around it, still glowing, timing, pathway. How many lineages tried similar tricks, but the existence of the trick is not up for argument. You marvel at the audacity of anatomy, at evolution's refusal to waste parts. If they can be repurposed, the room doesn't clap, it nods, like someone who has seen a difficult craft done well and prefers gratitude to applause. You drift toward a low display of footprints again, not Latoli this time, but a later trackway, hardened into stone, toes splayed slightly, stride confident. The label refuses romance. It lists angles, pressures, distances, but the prints themselves insist on humanity. Someone walked here, in this direction, with this weight, and this pace, and this purpose we cannot read. The argument they invite is not about whether walking mattered. It's about how many different lives walking made possible, and which we've forgotten to count. You stop at a small cube of preserved tissue under a bell jar, lung, delicate as frost on a window before the sun finds it. The card notes its glories and its failings in equal measure. Alveoli like endless rooms for air exchange, vulnerability to grit, smoke, spores, and time. Then a second line, smaller. The story of the human body is never a trial. It's a ledger. You are tempted to correct it, to say, ledger sounds cold. But then you remember a ledger is also the place where debts are forgiven, balances carried over, and sometimes a line is drawn under a messy column and a new page begins, not because the math is solved, but because a new day demands a new accounting. You pass a photo box with a humble thread and needle and a stitched wound drawn on wax, a reminder that culture became a co-author long ago. The debates here are not only about bones and genes. They're about the moment mending became part of biology's plan, when kept bodies wrote different futures than broken ones. Infection, anesthesia, antisepsis, each a punctuation mark. In the margins that changed the sentences above them, the room shrugs at purity. It prefers collaborations. Farther on, a set of pelvis models rotates slowly, old to new and back again, angles shifting under the light. You feel the urge to ask for a verdict. Which one is better? Which one is to blame? The room declines the invitation. It offers a softer truth. Functions share a house. Efficiency and childbirth. Posture and gait, comfort and risk, roommates, negotiating space. Some days they get along. Some nights they argue loud enough to wake the neighbors. The house somehow stands. You arrive at a corner where the air is cooler, the light thinner, like evening leaning in. Here, framed in a simple mount, a tailbone sits the vestige that watches you sit too long and decides whether to complain. The card is almost playful. Remnants are reminders, not mistakes. Then, in smaller type, a sentence that sits with you longer than you expect. A species without remnants would be a species without a past. You tuck that thought into a pocket like a wooden coin you like to fiddle with when conversations run hot. A final lane leads you toward a modest platform with two chairs facing each other across a small round table. On the table are 4 cards: selection, drift, constraint, contingency. You take a seat and lay the cards out. One by one, the way children lay down strengths in a simple game. You realize that every argument in this room is a reshuffling of these four. Which one speaks loudest here? Which one whispers there? How much of the outcome was shaped by the physics that bones cannot ignore? How much by the accidents that culture cannot predict? You aren't an arbitrator. You're an audience. The room smiles at the humility of that role and the dignity, too, because good audiences change plays gently. By listening well, you sit for a while longer, watching the light make slow geometry on the floor. Speaking in turns, then you stand. The exit ahead is a simple door with no inscription, only a small window cut at eye level showing a sketch of a horizon that could be dawn or dusk. Your hand finds the latch, and you pause with a familiar ache in the shoulders that comes from carrying both awe and doubt. The room behind you doesn't mind, it likes doubt. It knows awe can handle it. You open the door into a corridor where the air smells faintly of rain about to happen. Somewhere, voices are already preparing arguments you'll hear later, discoveries you'll touch, revisions you'll accept with a wry smile. You step forward, and the floor greets your feet the way old paths do, with a recognition that feels like permission. You move down the corridor that smells like rain, and it opens into a long gallery where the ceiling hangs low at first, then rises with each step, as if the room wants to give you more space the more patient you become. On your left, a quiet, slowly rotating case holds a single fossil vertebra with a thin, healed notch along its edge. The placard doesn't tell a dramatic tale. Cluster around it someone once lived long enough for bone to lay down new scaffolding, for the pain to fade into a dull teacher. Was this survival the work of community care or stubborn biology? Historians still argue whether the earliest forms of social nursing among hominins truly emerged out of empathy or out of mutual necessity in small bands that could not afford to lose anyone who could still contribute. You cup your hands to the glass, not to see better, but to listen more carefully to the hush around the evidence. Farther on, root from brain to voice box, dipping into the chest and back again like a traveler with a flawed map. Engineers scowl. Evolution shrugs. Constraint speaks here in a measured voice. Paths laid down early become roads later generations must travel, even when a shortcut would make more sense. You feel a little protective of that loop, a little irritated too, and then you smile at how perfectly it embodies the thesis of the room. Bodies are stories that couldn't start over. They could only keep writing. You pause at an island display 3 models of pelvis geometry, each set to demonstrate gait, childbirth mechanics, and stability. A fraction wider, stride length shorten, fetal head diameters adjust by millimeters that mean the difference between a straightforward delivery and a long night. Historians still argue whether the so-called obstetric dilemma is best framed as pelvis size versus neonatal brain size, or whether metabolic demands during gestation are the true limiting factor, with pelvis width acting more like a secondary negotiator in a crowded room. You lean back, and the models continue to walk without you, as if to remind you that arguments go on whether you're watching or not. A shadow box nearby holds 2 tools, separated by millennia, a carefully napped hand axe and a simple iron knife with a wrapped handle. They whisper the same boast in different dialects: shedge leverage, control. You trace the thought that tool-making and brain growth encouraged each other in a long, spiraling duet. Historians still argue whether language rode that same spiral as a passenger or stepped in as a new driver that taught hands to serve sentences as much as survival. The box doesn't propose an answer. It lets your thumbs itch with the urge to try shaping a flake from a core, to feel thought move into muscle. You come upon a low-lit theater where a looped projection plays to reconstructions of the same ancient site, one with bones arranged by scavengers, another with deliberate placement by human hands. The film switches between them with only subtle changes. You sit on the bench and let your eyes soften until the patterns breathe. Historians still argue whether certain burials were truly burials, whether pigment was paint or byproduct, whether beads were adornment or accounting. You realize that certainty often appears in hindsight only because we've forgotten how noisy the present is. At the theater's edge, a smaller case glows with a single feathered imprint beside a finger-length bone. Transitions again limb to wing, balance, to glide, to powered flight. The lesson isn't that your body carries echoes of wings. It's that structures find new work when old work no longer pays the rent. Auditory bones recruited from jaws, wrists that learned new arcs, ankles that learned patience. A threshold or a staircase. You prefer the staircase, steep in places, shallow in others, but always with a landing where breath can be caught and debate can take notes. The hall widens and hush deepens. Here, a row of skulls looks forward not in pride, just in posture. Some are robust, with wide zygomatic arches. Some are delicate, with high vaults. Gentle with their language, likely suggests, indicates, consistent with. You're grateful for the humility. In a corner, a small sign says, "Beware of straight lines on crooked maps." You carry it with you like a pocket charm. You turn a corner, and the floor picks up a shallow incline. Knee joints walks through deep time, cartilage thickness, condyle shape, meniscus resilience, ligament placement. Each seems to argue a different emphasis stability here. You know the ending of the sequence already because you feel it on flights of stairs and after long car rides. But it comforts you to see the full lineage. This knee was not badly designed. It was repurposed successfully enough, and in the reuse lies both your freedom to walk and your fate to ice and wrap. Midway up the incline, a quiet side room opens. No fossils, no tools. They describe bones that never made headlines, sites that turned out to be less than first hoped, hypotheses revised and revised again. You read an entry about a single tooth found at dusk and the long night that followed, building and dismantling stories around it. Historians still argue whether one fragment is ever enough to carry a narrative. The diaries imply a better question. How many fragments make a mosaic before we're honest enough to call it incomplete anyway? You step back onto the incline and it levels into a broad landing with a table you recognize from earlier round top. 2 chairs, but now the 4 cards are replaced by 4 small weights. Each weight bears one word: evidence, assumption, method, story. You place evidence on one side of the table and watch it tip. You add method, and the table steadies a little. Assumption slides things around more than you'd like. Story, surprisingly, unbalance the table when the other 3 are present. It frames them, keeps them from rolling off. You take your hands away and the balance holds, not perfectly, just well enough to keep coffee cups from sliding. Beyond the landing, a narrow corridor leads past vignettes that feel like footnotes turned into sculptures. A model nasal cavity paired with climate maps asks whether airflow and heat exchange shaped bridges, and width soar, whether drift and founder effects left those signatures by happenstance, later blessed with adaptive stories. A series of vertebrae with tiny holes marked along the sides suggests blood supply routes and nerve paths. Constraint nods again, reminding you that there are only so many ways to thread cables through a tower that must also bend and bear. A pair of femurs, one thicker, one lighter, leans against a panel that wonders about mobility, load, and nutrition. None of it is absolute. All of it is honest. You emerge into a brighter space where a single installation dominates the room. A timeline printed not as a line, but as a rope with splices, knots, and frayed ends. Small tags hang from it. Archaeopteryx and its kin. A pelvis. From a riverbed, footprints that made a volcanic ash immortal. A jaw pulled from sediment like a whispered confession. A shoulder blade that redrew a shoulder story. Between the knots are long lengths with no tags at Alira's full of lives. We don't know how to read yet. The rope is beautiful because it is incomplete, strong because of the places where it has been repaired, without pretending the repairs are originals. At the rope's end, a simple mirror waits. You've seen mirrors before in these halls, but this one's frame is nothing, just glass. You meet your own face again, and you see the debates in the set of your brow, the tilt of your jaw, the posture you've unconsciously adjusted since you started walking through these rooms. You don't look improved, you look informed. It's a quiet change. One mainstream fact to listen. Picture the transitional fossil with jointed fins, again Tiktaalik sitting at 375 million years past. The kind of find that doesn't end an argument but anchors it. A lantern in a very old twilight. It didn't close a case. It showed where to keep looking. One quirky or fringe fact to listen. A soft grin crosses your mind at a Victorian parlor claim that measuring skull bumps phrenology could divine character. A cautionary myth dressed as science. It reminds you how easy it is to mistake tidy stories for true ones, and how important it is to let evidence veto elegance. Historians still argue whether language arose in a single flowering or in many partial blooms that cross-pollinated over time, whether fire's control was a punctuated leap or a sticky gradient, whether the first stitches were for wounds or clothes. You breathe with the comfort that the arguing isn't a flaw. It is the pulse of the work. You step away from the mirror and notice a doorway ahead with a lintel carved in small letters. Revise kindly. You pass beneath it, and the corridor beyond narrows like a throat before opening into a calm that feels earned rather than given. The air is cooler here, the kind that wakes the skin without asking permission. Somewhere a page turns, not for drama, but because that's how stories continue when endings are postponed in favor of better beginnings. You reach a final shelf on this side of the gallery, with two modest items, a spool of thread and a pencil with a worn eraser. Thread for joining, eraser for unjoining. You take neither, but you let the shapes soak in reminders that your body's story is stitched and restitched, written and rewritten, and that the best writers you've met in these rooms are the ones who love their erasers as much as their pens. You turn toward the exit at the far end, and the floor under your feet feels confident again, as if the building itself approves of anyone who walks with curiosity and changes their mind with grace. Outside, somewhere, rain finally starts up. Soft, meticulous tapping that sounds exactly like evidence arriving one drop at a time. You pause in a quiet vestibule where the air smells like linen and tea, and the light is the warm kind that makes wood look like it remembers stories. There's no exhibit here, no fossils, no timelines, just a bench and a small sign on the wall that reads, "Begin where you are." You sit, your shoulders drop a centimeter, your jaw loosens half a notch. That feels like a good start. You stand and the corridor ahead opens into a workshop disguised as a calm room, shelves with everyday objects, a rug with a grid barely visible in its weave, a low table set with simple tools. The room whispers, a promise, no heroics, only small, boring things that work when done often enough. You walk to the first shelf and find a pair of shoes with a note tucked inside, "Respect the arch." You turn the card over and it's gentler than you expected. It suggests that feet like variety, some barefoot minutes for strength, some supported minutes for distance, and wide toe boxes that let bones and tendons arrange themselves like they remember how. It doesn't scold or prescribe, it invites. Experiments spaced over weeks, not days. You set the shoes back and feel your toes flex inside whatever you're wearing now, as if they heard their name. Next shelf, a chair that isn't really a chair. It's a stool, a cushion, a slanted board, and a strip of floor, all in a neat stack, with a card that reads, "Change is the posture." The idea lands softly. No single position is the cure. The cure is moving through positions, stacking ribs, over pelvis, often, slouching, sometimes without guilt, standing now and then, taking stairs as tiny opportunities. You picture your spine as a column that loves to be asked different questions across the day. The room smiles, you think, because it knows 1 minute is a unit large enough to matter. A low drawer slides open to reveal a row of timers and gentle chimes. The labels don't talk about productivity. They talk about relief. Every 30 minutes, a long breath, a stand, a shoulder roll. Every few hours, a walk to the window, a stretch that feels indecently pleasant, a drink of water that tastes like permission. The timers don't demand, they remind. You take one, and the second hand starts to move. A small, round coach that speaks only in kindness. Across the room, a rack holds light weights, resistance bands, and a jump rope that looks like it belongs equally to a playground and a boxing gym. The sign above them is playful. Make friends with your tendons. It suggests that tendons are like trustworthy old bridges. They get stronger with steady loads, not with surprise trucks. Slow calf raises for Achilles, patient rows for shoulders, gentle hip hinges for backs. A few sets, a few times a week, long enough for the tissue to reply, "Ah, this again. I can build for this." You picture collagen fibers braiding thicker, the way rope makers coil strands into something boats can trust. Dot in the corner. A square of floor space is marked with quiet shapes, a line to walk, a circle to turn within, a triangle for foot placements. The card says, "Balance is learned, then forgotten, then learned again." You step onto the line barefoot and place one foot in front of the other, feeling tiny muscles around your ankles wake like birds at first light. You turn slowly within the circle, eyes soft, letting the inner ear send its quiet coordinates. It feels silly until it feels wise. There's a shelf of bowls next to a carafe of water, slices of lemon floating like little suns. The bowls hold salt, nuts, beans, leafy things, berries, olive oil, dark chocolate, not in lecture quantities, just enough to look friendly. The placard is brief. Feed your furnace kindly. It doesn't offer a manifesto. It offers patterns, plants most days, protein each meal, fiber like a steady drumbeat, fats that leave joints and moods unruffled, sugar as a guest who's welcome but doesn't get a drawer. It suggests listening. How did lunch make the next 2 hours feel? It suggests forgiving. How did dinner rescue the day that ran away? You sip the lemon water and feel a quiet click as systems you can't name nod in approval. On a narrow cart are sleep things that look almost comical in there. Simplicity, a soft mask, a dim amber bulb, a small notebook, a fan earplugs, a cup without a handle. The card calls sleep a nightly renovation and offers a ritual like a recipe. Dim the lights an hour before. WRITE, the list that was shouting so it can whisper. Warm shower or cool room, choose one. A bit of salt, a bit of water, so muscle and pulse play nicely. The same songs of darkness at the same time most nights. It reminds you that bodies adore patterns, the way gardens adore seasons, not as a prison, but as a promise. At the far wall, a pegboard carries a handful of quick moves, like useful spells, the long exhale that lowers the room inside your chest, the hand on heart that convinces the drum to take it easier, the side stretch that makes the ribs remember they are hinged doors, the hip hinge that lets the back keep its proud curve while reaching low, the ankle alphabet that seems ridiculous until stairs stop complaining. The pegboard reads, practice before pain. You try the long exhale in 4-4, out for 8, and feel your pulse lose its hurry. Like a dog that decided not to chase the squirrel, after all, another shelf holds a first aid kit with additions, tape for ankles that wobble in new shoes, a lacrosse ball for tender fascia, heat for tight mornings, cold for puffy afternoons, magnesium for leg whispers at night, a towel that becomes a stretch strap, a notebook page titled What Helped Last Time. The card says, make allies for your future self. It's not prescriptive. It's affectionate, like someone handing you a key you didn't know you'd lost. In a nook, framed like a small stage, sits a stool and a metronome. Above it, cadence is compassion. The note below suggests that on runs or walks, a slightly quicker, lighter step often treats knees and hips more kindly. That on lifts, a slower, eccentric lets tendons learn. That on hard days, cadence isn't just steps per minute. It's how often you let a breath be longer than the thought that troubled it. A small easel nearby holds a card with 4 words from the last room selection: drift, constraint, contingency. But each is paired with a gentle practice. Selection gives train what you want more of, slowly. Drift gives forgive what arrived without your vote. Constraint gives work with the angles and levers you have, not the ones on posters. Contingency gives plan for obstacles with spare shoes, spare snacks, spare grace. The next alcove is quiet as a chapel and smells faintly of pine. On a shallow shelf are 3 stones, smooth and pocket-sized, etched with single words: move, nourish, restore. You put your fingertips on each in turn, and a simple cadence suggests itself. Most days, 20 to 40 minutes, where breath and muscle have a lively conversation. Most meals, plants, and protein that don't make the next hour sleepy. Most nights, hours enough that mornings feel like someone opened the curtains, not like someone turned on a siren. The stones are not commandments. They are reminders. You step into a smaller side room, dressed like a friendly lab, a blood pressure cuff, a tape measure, a calendar with wide squares, a pen that writes smoothly. The sign says, measure sparingly, notice generously. It suggests checking a few easy markers now and then, pulse at rest, how quickly it settles after a climb, how sleep feels, how joints feel the morning after a big day, how mood speaks at lunch, and charting them without judgment. It promises that trend lines drawn in pencil are kinder than verdicts carved in stone. Back in the main room, a final shelf holds a short stack of letters addressed to future you. They're blank. A card invites you to write one on a day when the body feels good, a recipe of what helped, not a scolding of what didn't. You date it, fold it. You take a page, write a few plain lines. Walks after dinner, phone asleep outside the bedroom, water on the desk before the day begins. Shoes that don't pinch, the stretch that always makes the lower back sigh, and tuck the letter into the stack with a quiet satisfaction. You're almost at the exit, when you notice a tiny door you would have missed if the light hadn't shifted. Inside is a room the size of a closet, with a single mirror and a single rule on the wall. Speak to your body as if it were a friend who did you a favor. You try it, feeling silly for 3 seconds, and then oddly relieved. Thank you for the knees that protested but went anyway. Thank you for the lungs that stayed when the air felt heavy. Thank you for the hands that fixed the day for someone else. The mirror does not answer. The chest does. With one calmer beat, you leave the closet and the main door opens to a short corridor where the sound changes. A soft city of small lives. Tea poured, pages turned, a bike chain, a laugh, a window sliding up, a footstep on a stair that has learned your weight. The corridor leads toward a modest sign that reads, "Keep it boring, keep it beautiful." You smile, because boring and beautiful might be the exact coordinates of a body well kept. A last alcove waits by the exit with a handful of if-then cards, arranged like travel tips. If mornings ache, then warm the joints before loading them. Gentle cat-cow. Ankle circles. A shower that tells fascia the sun is up. If the back frets, then hinge from hips. Keep loads close. Let the breath do half the lift. If the knees grumble, then shorten the stride and stack the knee over the second toe on descents. If the shoulders sulk, then pull twice as often as you push, and stop living with elbows flared like wings. If sleep slips, then chase light in the morning, chase dark at night, and let caffeine bow out at midday like a polite guest. If stress raises the room inside your ribs, then make the exhale longer, the jaw softer, the gaze wider. None of the cards promise perfection. They promise partnership. You step through the exit, and the air outside folds around you like a well-worn jacket. The world is unchanged in the ways that matter, and entirely new in the way your attention lands. Heel, toe, spring, release. Inhale, exhale. A staircase becomes choreography. A glass of water becomes a message passed along a friendly chain. A quiet evening becomes renovation behind the scenes. You touch your sternum lightly, the old drum agrees, and you walk on. Not toward a cure, but toward a practice. A small, repeatable kindness offered to a body that has carried you through rooms older than language and will, with luck and care, carry you through many more. You linger just outside the last doorway, as if the air here is different, lighter somehow, but carrying all the rooms you've just moved through. Behind you are the fossils and compromises, the quiet superpowers, the accidents, the debates, and the small, unglamorous acts of care. They don't dissolve when you leave. They follow you like the scent of something warmed in your hands. A short path leads you toward an open arch, and through it the world moves as it always has. Clouds dragging shadows over rooftops, a bird adjusting its wings mid-flight, someone laughing into their sleeve as they pass on the sidewalk. Your body steps forward automatically, not because you've forgotten the lessons behind you, but because it's built for forward motion to cross thresholds without looking back. Every time you feel, in a way you didn't before, the weight and generosity of what's carrying you. The knees and ankles negotiating with each surface, the lungs quietly trading air for possibility, the heart flexing and resting in turn, the skin adjusting to the shift between shadow and sun. None of it is perfect. None of it needs to be. It is all enough, and enough is a kind of grace. You pass a shop window and catch your reflection. For a breath, you don't see flaws or even features. You see a vessel layered with accidents, inheritances, skillful hacks, and stubborn repairs. A biography written in tendon and scar, in nerve and cadence, in choices you made and choices made for you long before you arrived. You let the sight sit with you, not as pride or burden, but as truth. A breeze moves down the street, and you notice your shoulders ease with it. Somewhere in the back of your mind, the halls you've walked are still open. You can return to them anytime, to hear the debates again, to stand in the glow of your body's quiet miracles, to remember the ledger without scolding it. But right now, the world itself feels like another gallery, one you walk through without glass cases or signs, just the sound of your breath and the rhythm of your steps. You head toward your day or your night, carrying nothing more special than awareness. But awareness, you realize, changes how the ground feels underfoot, how the air tastes on the inhale, how you speak to yourself when something twinges or startles. You are not a perfect design. You are an evolving practice, and the practice is ongoing. At the corner, a light changes, and you cross with the others. Heel to toe, spring to release, heart in its patient loop, vision tracking the movement around you. No one notices that you've just finished a journey through time, through bone and nerve and chance and care. That's fine. The work was never about being noticed. It was about learning to notice yourself, and then, without ceremony, walking on. You pause for one last moment before turning in, letting the quiet settle over you like a soft blanket. The rooms you've walked through today, the bones, the breath, the trade-offs, the small kindnesses, they'll still be there tomorrow, waiting without hurry. For now, your body asks for nothing complicated, a stretch, a sip of water, the slow fold into rest. Outside, the night has settled its own rhythm. You match it without thinking. Inhale, exhale, the day sliding away in gentle waves. You are here, carried by the same vessel that's ferried you through every morning and every dusk. And tonight, all it needs is stillness. So close your eyes. Let the weight of your muscles melt into whatever cradles you. Let your thoughts wander, only far enough to find calm. The world can hold itself until you return. Good night. Sleep well. I'll see you back in the light.